Throughout history, certain places have earned a reputation, not because of what they are, but because of what happened inside of them. There's an aura surrounding them. Walls that witnessed violence, rooms that held onto fear and fed off of it, homes that were never meant to become legends, some from the early 1800s, but some only as far back as the 1970s. From small town residences to historic landmarks, these houses have become something more than just structures. They have become stories shaped by tragedy, mystery, and the people who lived and died within them. This season, we step into 5 of the most infamous haunted houses in America. The Sallie House, Villisca Axe Murder House, the Bellaire House, the Whaley House, and finally, the Hinsdale Dandy House. Each with its own history, each with its own claims, each with something that refuses to be forgotten. Are these places truly haunted, or are they just reflections of the tragedies tied to them? This is not just about ghost stories, it's about what lingers long after the doors close, the lights go out, and the past refuses to stay buried. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. In Atchison, Kansas, there is a house on North 2nd Street, and it has been waiting. The windows face the road like eyes that never close. The rooms inside have been walked through by investigators, television crews, and people just drawn to the unknown. All of them looking for answers to questions that have been sitting open for nearly a century. Some of them left with scratches, some left with nothing at all except an eerie feeling that someone or something was watching them. This house is called the Sallie House, but before the cameras, before the investigations, before it became one of the most investigated properties in the country, there was a child, a little girl no older than 6, who some believe took her last breath inside these walls. Her name may have been Sallie. The records, as we'll get into, are murky at best, and somewhere between the death and the decades that followed, the girl became the ghost. The ghost became the story, and the story became something people are still trying to make sense of. This episode is not just about a haunted house, it's about a child at the center of it, whose story has been passed down in pieces and fragments and whispers. It's about what happens when a person becomes a legend, and the legend is built on grief. Her name is Sallie, and the house on North 2nd Street has never let anyone forget it. Before we get into it, you need to know something important. There is no verified death certificate for a child named Sallie connected to the house on North 2nd Street. No hospital record, no coroner's report, no official documentation that confirms the story you're about to hear. And just like with Annabelle Higgins, the absence of paperwork does not make a story disappear. If anything, it just makes it harder to put down. So what do we actually know? Atchison, Kansas is the kind of town that holds on to its history. It sits along the Missouri River and carries the kind of weight that old river towns tend to carry. Frontier settlers, Civil War tension, disease outbreaks, loss that was documented and loss that wasn't. Locals will tell you it's one of the most haunted cities in the country, and whether you believe that or not, the house on North 2nd Street keeps coming up at the center of that conversation. The building dates back to somewhere between 1867 and 1871. It's not dramatic to look at. 2 stories, it's pretty modest. The kind of place you'd walk past without giving it a second thought. But local oral history and accounts that have been repeated and documented over several decades say the house once belonged to a physician named Dr. Charles Finney. His medical practice operated out of the 1st floor. The front rooms were office space and exam areas. He and his family lived upstairs. That setup was completely normal for a small-town doctor at the turn of the century. You lived where you worked. People came to you in the middle of the night, sick and scared, and you handled it with whatever you had. The full story, as it's been told, goes like this. A frantic mother arrived at the house one day with her 6-year-old daughter. The girl had collapsed from severe abdominal pain. Dr. Finney diagnosed appendicitis and made a judgment call that there wasn't enough time to wait. He began emergency surgery right there in the home. But something went wrong. He made the first incision before the anesthesia had fully taken effect. The girl screamed, and then she stopped. She died on his table. Her name, according to the local legend, was Sallie. Now here's where it gets complicated. Some researchers have pointed to a real person named Sallie Isabel Hall as a possible historical match. But here's the thing. The records indicate that Sallie Isabel Hall was a 34-year-old woman, not a child. Not the little girl with a bow in her hair that the drawing depicts inside the house. So whatever that connection is, the legend just doesn't hold up. In fact, there are people who claim the entire Sallie story was invented by a local mayor as a publicity stunt to draw tourists to Atchison. I'm not saying that's true, but it's on the table here in this story. After Sallie's supposed death, the house just moved on the way old houses do. It changed hands, families came and went. Ethel Anderson lived there from 1958 all the way to 1990, and until her death in 2000, she maintained that nothing unusual ever happened during her 4 decades in the house. Nothing. That detail gets glossed over a lot, but it's also worth noting. Decades passed. Whatever the walls were holding, they held it quietly. But that all changed in 1992, or 1993, depending on which account you're reading. The dates do conflict slightly, but what does not dispute is who moved in. Tony and Deborah Pickman. They were a young, newly married couple expecting their first child, a son that they would name Taylor. When they rented the house on North 2nd Street, they were not paranormal investigators. They weren't looking for a story. They were a young couple who needed a home, and this place was available. They moved in with no particular knowledge of what that house was once used for, or what others believed lingered inside. What followed is documented across interviews, television appearances, and even a book that Deborah later wrote called The Sallie House Haunting. Years of accounts that Tony had given publicly, these were all there. And I want to be clear, I'm going to lay this out honestly the way the facts exist, without pushing in either direction. Now, the activity by Tony's account would start small, like light bulbs burning out. The oven timer would randomly turn on by itself. Their phone would cut out and suddenly come back. Their dog kept growling and barking at the nursery. At first, it all seemed easy to blame on an old house, but after Taylor was born, things started to change. Temperatures would suddenly drop, electronics began malfunctioning more often, and the atmosphere in the house felt different. Then, in the summer of 1993, the first major unexplained incident happened. Tony walked into the nursery, and he found stuffed animals, bears, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. He immediately accused Deborah of setting this up as a prank, but she insisted she had nothing to do with it. Then things started to ramp up. Fires appeared without any source. Objects were moved, and Tony began waking up with scratches along his body, deep, deliberate-looking marks that hadn't been there when he went to sleep. Whatever was in that house seemed to have a specific problem with just him. The attacks were directed at Tony consistently, while the rest of the family were largely left alone. And then there was the other presence, the smaller one. Throughout everything they experienced, there was also the child. A little girl felt near the stairs, sensed in doorways, glimpsed in the corners of the rooms. A California psychic named Barbara, who came to the house, told the Pickmans that Sallie was harmless, that she might have just been afraid of men due to some kind of abuse that she sustained in life. They say she only scratched Tony out of anxiety, not malice. But Deborah took this seriously. She started talking to Sallie directly, acknowledging her, even gift wrapping a doll for her. You're not going to guess who unwrapped that gift. Investigators who later came through the house reported the same child presence, separately, consistently. It felt different from the aggression directed at Tony. It felt like something had been there for a very long time. And they called her Sallie. The Pickmans' time in the house finally came to an end when Tony said an unseen force tried to push him off an upstairs balcony. That was the final straw. They left, but the documentation they left behind, the recordings, the interviews, the investigators they brought through, and eventually Deborah's book became the foundation for everything the Sallie house would go on to become.
Right back after a crucial break.
Now, after the Pickmans left, the story didn't leave with them. A medium who had worked with the family shared their experiences with Fox TV, which led to an appearance on Sightings, one of the earliest mainstream programs to treat paranormal investigation as legitimate broadcast journalism. During the Sightings crew visit, deep scratches appeared on his arms, back, and stomach on camera. For a lot of people, the episode was the beginning. It introduced Atchison to audiences who had never heard of it, and it framed the story in a way that would prove very hard to shake. A haunted house, a young couple, a child spirit, a dark, aggressive force targeting the husband specifically. Clean, digestible, and unsettling in the way that only something presented as real can be. Then came the dramatic retellings. There were shows like A Haunting, which did an episode in 2006, and Paranormal Witness, which aired The Harpy episode in 2013. These shows specialize in recreating first-person accounts with actors, dramatic music, and cinematic staging. We've all seen them, and we've all changed the channel. But this one was different. They're storytelling vehicles, and like every storytelling vehicle, they make choices. They decide how the child looks when she appears in the corner. They decide how the scratches sound when they form on skin. And they decide which details land and which ones get cut. Every one of those decisions moves the story a little bit further from what actually happened inside that house. With all of these retellings, Sallie became more vivid. The aggression became more elaborate. The house, a modest 2-story structure on a residential street, started carrying the visual weight of something designed specifically to terrify. That's what happens when a story gets passed through different hands. It doesn't always become a lie, but it does become a different version. And the details that tend to disappear are usually the ones that slow things down, the ones that raise questions, the ones that make it feel a little bit more human. Unlike most of the other cases we have spoken about here, the Sallie house never became a Hollywood franchise. Just yet. No theatrical trilogy, no blockbuster reimagining. The distortion here was quieter and slower, built over decades of documentary television and word of mouth rather than one big cultural moment. But the effect is the same. The house is now famous for what people believe happened inside it, and the girl it's named for has become more of a symbol than a person. Sallie, as she exists in the cultural conversation today, is a composite. She's the tragedy that gives the haunting its emotional center. The innocent presence that makes the darker entity feel more sinister by contrast. She became, without anyone necessarily intending it, a narrative device. Somewhere underneath all that, there may be a real child whose story deserves more careful handling than it's received. But where the truth lies in this story, we just may never know. When you strip the Sallie house story back to what can actually be verified, the picture gets a lot smaller than the legend surrounding it. Let's start with Sallie and who she might be. Was she Sallie Isabel Hall all along? Was she a 34-year-old woman, not a child? That thread doesn't go where the legend says it does, but we know how this game of paranormal telephone can go over the years. And again, some people flat out claim the story was fabricated by a city official. We don't know if that's true, but we also can't ignore it as a claim, much like the rest of the accusations. Now, Dr. Finney's use of the house as a medical office is at least plausible. Small-town doctors absolutely worked from home in that era. Some even do today. But again, no records publicly confirming that specific use of the property. It's just simply not there. The biggest account we have to go by is that of the Pickmans. Tony and Deborah Pickman are the real people who lived in the house and gave the real accounts of what they experienced. Tony's testimony has been consistent across years of interviews and appearances, and consistency counts for something, especially when so many of the stories, especially some we covered, managed to change over the years. The scratches, the fires, the objects that moved. None of that has any documentation, and why would it? All we have are Tony's words and Deborah's book. To some, that just might be enough. Now let's go back to Ethel Anderson, who lived in that house for 32 years and said nothing unusual happened. Ever. That's not nothing. If this house was a hotbed for paranormal activity, you'd expect at least something during 4 decades of occupancy. Her silence is a little bit interesting. But I'm curious, if nothing happened here for Ethel, could its history have been dug up once again years later, and again put out to the world by someone who wanted their story to be told? I'm not sure that would explain the Pickmans' claims, but it would add another layer we aren't quite sure about. Researchers who study paranormal folklore will also point out that the Sallie house story follows patterns that appear frequently in haunted location narratives. A tragic backstory involving a child, a dark, aggressive entity contrasting with the innocent presence, a specific target who bears physical evidence of something that just can't be explained. Does this mean nothing happened to the Pickmans? Not at all. Something happened to that family. Something affected them enough to document it, return to it, and talk about it for decades. What that something was is the question Atchison has been sitting with ever since. And unlike cases where the skeptical explanation wraps things up cleanly, this one hasn't been closed. The door is still open, which, depending on your perspective, is either frustrating or exactly the point. If you spent any time on YouTube at night, there's a decent chance the Sallie house has already found you. The house on North 2nd Street has become one of the most visited and most documented paranormal locations in the country, not just by local enthusiasts, but some of the biggest names in the investigation space. And unlike a lot of the locations that get one television appearance and fade back into the dark, the Sallie house keeps pulling people in. Investigators go once, and most come back. Skeptics go in curious and come out quiet. The house has a way of not letting the story end. Now let's get into my favorite part. When Ghost Adventures investigated in 2015, one of the things that caught people's attention was a dark mark on the basement floor. The outline of a pentagram still visible beneath a coat of black spray paint. And the story behind it adds a layer to this whole thing that the Sallie narrative alone doesn't account for. After the Pickmans left, a new tenant moved in, and that tenant, according to the property's owner at the time, Les Smith, painted a pentagram on the basement floor in what's believed to have been an attempt to summon the demon Beelzebub, one of the 7 deadly demons. Smith discovered it, evicted the tenant, and had it painted over, but the paint doesn't erase what some people believe it invited in. What makes this worse is that the Pickman years weren't the only time the house was being used for things it wasn't designed for. At some point when the property was vacant and run down, teenagers and others were reportedly using the basement for seances, with Ouija boards and rituals. Some investigators believe that that activity didn't just leave a mark on the floor, it left something behind. Something that came in through a door that nobody should have opened and nobody has closed. That theory reframes the entire Pickman experience, because if a demonic entity entered that house through deliberate ritual, separate from whatever Sallie's story actually is, then what Tony was living with wasn't a grieving child lashing out. It was something else entirely. Something that may have been using Sallie as a lure. And then there's the luminol test. Investigators who ran luminol in the master bedroom closet found blood splatter. A bloody sweater that was reportedly discovered in the attic. Neither has been fully explained. Neither fits neatly into the story of a little girl who died downstairs over 100 years ago. They point to something else happening in that house, at some point by someone that has never been accounted for. What were they doing in there? What they found in the basement does not change the conversation. It blows the original conversation wide open. Then there's Project Fear. If you haven't found them yet, go look them up after this. They dedicated not 1 but 3 episodes to the Sallie house, which in itself says something. The The standout for me is when Chelsea went back alone for a solo investigation, with no team, no safety net, just her and whatever the house decided to do with the night.
If there is somebody down here, or something down here, can you tell me?
I'm not really super familiar.
Open?
But I recognize your
Open
voice.
what?
That footage is hard to explain away, whether you go in as skeptic or not. Chelsea's solo return is definitely worth your time to watch. BuzzFeed Unsolved Supernatural revisited the Sallie house not once but twice. First in Season 1, Episode 3 back in 2016, which for a lot of the younger viewers was their introduction to the property. Ryan and Shane brought their signature dynamic to it, one half genuinely unnerved, other half refusing to be, and the house that had something to say regardless of which position you stood. Then they came back for their Season 7 finale in 2021, Return to the Demonic Sallie House. The second visit is where things started to get really interesting. At one point, a flashlight responded to direct commands, turning on and off on request. Fans voted it was the best supernatural evidence in the show's history. But now let's go back to the basement once again. The pentagram introduces the possibility that the history of the house isn't just the story of a little girl who died and never left. It raises more questions of what happened within those walls, and what may have been practiced there. When the duo Sam and Kobe visited the Villisca axe murder house, which we're going to cover next week, they were told a story by investigator John Hauser that when standing on the pentagram, he felt a scratch on his leg. When checking out the scratch, it appeared to be a burn. His hair was torched, gone. Now Sam did the Estes method while sitting on the pentagram, then in later episodes claimed that he has an attachment of a spirit in his ass from that experience. Sorry. Yeah, take that as you will. What all of this evidence does is just build a case that has no proof. That word doesn't belong here, and I won't pretend otherwise. But something, a weight of accounts, of recordings, of reported physical experiences that keep serious investigators returning and casual visitors leaving with something they didn't bring in. Yes, they are TV shows, they are YouTube videos, so we must view them with an open mind and a grain of salt. But nonetheless, this stuff is out there for you to decide. Now, the house on North 2nd Street is still there, and it's still taking visitors, and by most accounts, it's still very much active. You too can visit this house for only a $20 ticket to have a moment. They get their episode, their article, their viral clip, and then the world moves on. Most places can't hold attention for long unless there's something seriously riveting. The Sallie house is not most places. Decades after the Pickmans left North 2nd Street, the house is still drawing people, still generating footage beyond what they put in their books. It's still producing accounts from investigators and visitors who arrived skeptical and left with something they won't ever be able to articulate. That kind of staying power isn't accidental. Now, part of it is Sallie. A child at the center of a haunting changes the emotional weight of everything around it. It's harder to be dismissive. It's harder to lean into the thrill of it without also feeling something more tender underneath. When investigators walk through that house and sense a small presence near the stairs or near the stuffed animals, something in us responds to that differently than a shadow in a hallway or a voice on a recorder. It lands somewhere deeper. Because children aren't supposed to be left behind. They're not supposed to be standing in the corner of a dark room or turning on a TV or still waiting for someone to notice them. Whether Sallie was ever real, the idea of her is real now, and that idea has a lot of weight. With some haunted locations, a skeptical investigation closes the loop. A structural issue accounts for the sounds. A psychological explanation covers the experiences. The mystery shrinks when you look at it directly. The Sallie house has never been looked at directly, by people who came specifically to debunk it, and the loop has never been closed. The scratches still appear. The recordings still pick up things that weren't audible in the room at the time. The pentagram in the basement still raises questions a simple, rational framework just doesn't fully answer. And Tony Pickman, years after leaving, is still talking about what happened to him there. That unresolved quality is magnetic. We don't like open endings. We go back. We send investigators in hoping that this time something will either confirm everything or explain everything. And when neither of that happens, we come back again. There's also something specific to Atchison that feeds off of all of this. The river, the bluffs, the age of the buildings, and the density of history packed into a relatively small geographical space. Atchison has been called one of the most haunted cities in America, often enough that it's become part of the town's identity, even if it was them that gave themselves that nickname. The Sallie house exists within that context, and that context gives it a legitimacy it might not carry if it sat somewhere else. The house feels like it belongs to a town that has always made room for the unexplained. The story of the Sallie house reflects something we see repeated across paranormal history: innocence. Sallie's innocence is what makes the story bearable. Her presence is what keeps it human, and somewhere in the process of all of that, the child herself gets lost. Buried underneath pentagrams, Ouija boards, demonic energy, and attachments in people's asses. If Sallie was a real little girl who lived and died and felt that pain in Atchison, Kansas, we don't truly know her story. We know the version that survived, the version shaped by oral tradition and television production, and decades of investigators walking through her house with cameras and recorders, all looking for proof of something extraordinary. We don't know what she loved. We don't know who held her hand. We don't know if anyone who remembered her with simple, ordinary affection ever got to tell that version of her story before the other one took over. And if there is a real Sallie underneath all of this, she deserves more than being an emotional centerpiece of someone else's investigation. If Sallie is still in that house on North 2nd Street, I hope she's not afraid. And I hope that somewhere beneath all of the legend, she knows she hasn't been forgotten. Just maybe not remembered quite the way she deserved. In the next episode, we step inside the house soaked in something that no amount of time has been able to wash clean: the Villisca axe murder house. 6 members of the Moore family and 2 young house guests were found murdered in their beds in the small town of Villisca, Iowa. The killer was never convicted, the case was never truly closed, and the house where it all happened is still one of the most deeply unsettling locations in the country. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. In the small town of Villisca, Iowa, stands a quiet white house that has carried a dark reputation for more than a century. Known as the Villisca Axe Murder House, it became the site of one of the most brutal and mysterious crimes in American history. In the early hours of June 10th, 1912, 8 people were found murdered inside, 6 members of the Moore family and 2 young house guests. The killings were carried out with an axe taken from the home itself. The crime shocked the nation, and what followed only deepened the mystery. Suspects came and went, confessions surfaced and fell apart, and no one was ever convicted. For years, the story has lived on as both true crime and legend. Visitors now claim the house didn't just hold on to what happened that night. They say something stayed behind. Footsteps in empty rooms, voices in the dark, and an overwhelming feeling that you are not alone. But when we step beyond the fear and the folklore, the Villisca case becomes something even more unsettling. Not just because of what happened, because of what we never got answered. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. the southwest corner of Iowa, there's a small town called Villisca. The name is said to come from a Native American word meaning pretty place. And on any given afternoon, when the sun is cutting through the fields and the streets are quiet, you can almost see why they called it that. But then there's another name, Whallisca, and some locals say it, and that one means evil place. And after the night on June 9th of 1912, Villisca would never fully shake that second name. There is a house there, a modest white frame structure on a quiet residential street. From the outside, it looks like every other home in every other small Midwestern town. You would drive past it and not think twice. But the town of Villisca has thought about it every day for over 100 years because of what was discovered inside that one morning. 8 people bludgeoned to death in their beds. 6 of them were children. The killer was never convicted. The case was never truly closed, and the house itself, the same walls, the same rooms, the same floorboards, are still standing. Still accepting visitors. And according to every investigator who has ever walked through it after dark, it's still very much occupied. This is the Villisca Axe Murder House, and unlike the Sallie house, where we spent time asking whether the central tragedy actually happened, here, there's no mythology to untangle. No disputed records, no legend that may or may not be true. This one is all the way real, and that changes everything. To understand what Villisca became, you have to understand what it was. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This story is brutal and certainly not for the faint of heart. There are things you're about to hear, some for the first time, that will turn your stomach. This one took me a long time to get through, especially being a dad of 2. But here we go. Ironically, the Villisca Axe Murder House sits at 508 East 2nd Street. Now, does that sound familiar? Because the Sallie house, which we only covered last week, sits at 508 North 2nd Street. A strange coincidence, though 120 miles apart. Are there more connections between these two houses? We will see in just a little bit. Now let's talk about what this town was in 1912. Villisca was a small but functioning Midwestern town of about 2,500 people. Trains came through daily. Businesses lined the street. The CB&Q railroad line had helped it grow into a legitimate trade hub. People knew each other there. They went to the same churches, attended the same events, and trusted their neighbors. The Moore family fit right into the center of all of that. Josiah B. Moore was 43 years old, a respectable local businessman. His wife Sarah was 39. They had 4 children. Herman, who was 11. Mary Catherine, who everyone called Catherine, was 10. Arthur Boyd, who went by just Boyd, was 7. And little Paul Vernon, who was only 5 years old. By all accounts, they were well liked. They were good people, the kind of family that showed up in a small town and makes it better. And on the evening of June 9th, the Moore family attended a Children's Day program at the local Presbyterian church, an end-of-year Sunday school performance that Sarah had helped organize. 2 of Catherine's friends came along for the night, the Stillinger sisters, Lena Gertrude, who was age 11, and Ina May, who was age 8, daughters of a family who lived on a farm about 7 miles outside of the town. Josiah had called the Stillinger home that afternoon and asked if the girls could spend the night. It was cleared. It was ordinary. The kind of thing that happened all the time in a town like Villisca. It still happens today. The program ended around 9:30 that evening, and the Moore family walked home. They were just 3 blocks away from the church, with the Stillinger sisters in tow. They got inside somewhere around 9:45 or 10, and no one on that street ever saw them alive again. Sometime between midnight and 5 in the morning, someone entered the Moore house and killed all 8 people inside. Josiah and Sarah first, in the master bedroom. Then the 4 more children in the adjacent rooms upstairs. Then Lena and Ina Stillinger in the guest room downstairs. The weapon was an axe, believed to have just been taken from the Moore's own coal shed in the backyard. What the killer did with it goes beyond what most people can hold in their heads without putting it down. Josiah was struck with the blade of the axe and beaten an estimated 30 times. The blows were so forceful they left marks in the walls and the ceiling above the bed, marks that are still there today. You can actually see them. The other 7 victims were killed with the blunt side of the axe, a deliberate distinction, said to help the murders happen quicker rather than having a blade get stuck. After the Stillinger girls were killed downstairs, the killer went back upstairs and attacked the already dead bodies of the Moore family, striking them additional times, rendering several faces unrecognizable. And then, the killer walked calmly through the house, and he performed a series of deliberate, thoughtful acts. Every mirror in the home was covered, and covering mirrors was a common practice during wakes and funerals at the time, which raises its own ritualistic questions. The window blinds were drawn. On the 2 windows that had no blinds, pieces of the family's clothing were draped over them. The axe was carried into the girls' room downstairs, was wiped down, and leaned against a wall. A lamp upstairs had its glass chimney removed and its wick turned down to the faintest possible glow. In another weird act that may also have been tied to some sort of ritual, a 4-pound slab of raw bacon had apparently been removed from the icebox after the murders and just left on the floor. Sometimes described as wrapped in a towel or placed near the axe in the room where the Stillinger sisters were found. Food also sat untouched on the table beside a basin of bloody water in the kitchen. Investigators believed that every victim except Alina had been asleep when they were attacked. And then, this is the part that makes my heart race, my eyes water, my face turn red with anger and disgust. Lena appeared to have been awakened and possibly fought back, as she was discovered lying crosswise on the bed with what was believed to be a defensive wound on her arm. Her body appeared to have been moved after death, and some of her undergarments had been removed. The positioning of her body led investigators to consider whether the killer may have attempted some form of assault. However, later investigations reportedly found no evidence that assault had occurred. Just murder. And then, whoever did all of that just walked out of the house and disappeared forever. The next morning, June 10th, a neighbor named Mary Peckham grew concerned. It was getting late and the Moores hadn't come out to begin their morning chores. She knocked. No one answered. She then called Ross Moore, who was Josiah's brother, who came with a spare key. He entered the house. He opened the parlor and found the door to the guest room. He looked inside and saw the Stillinger sisters. He came back outside pale, trembling, and he called for help. Within minutes, word spread through Villisca. People came running before law enforcement could even secure the scene, and that was the first disaster after the murders. In 1912, crime scene protocol was essentially non-existent. Neighbors tracked through the house. People opened doors, looked into rooms. They touched things without thinking. Potential evidence was stepped on and lost before anyone with authority could even stop it. The house became both a crime scene and chaos at the same time. The county sheriff and coroner would later hold an inquest just one day after discovery on June 11th, interviewing 13 witnesses, but the damage to the physical evidence was already done. Doctors determined the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 in the morning. One more detail emerged that has stuck with investigators ever since. 2 spent cigarette butts were found in the attic. The killer had been inside the house before the family even arrived home from church. He had gone up to the attic and waited. While Josiah read to the children and Sarah put the little ones to bed and the Stillinger girls settled into the guest room downstairs, someone was crouched in the attic above them in the dark, waiting. The investigation that followed was by most accounts a disaster. Multiple suspects emerged over the weeks and months and years after the murders, and not one of them was ever successfully convicted. The case became one of the most complicated and contested in Iowa history, generating grand jury hearings, trials, and a prominent slander suit, and a political fallout that destroyed at least one public career. It also eventually helped establish what would become the Iowa State Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Now, these were the most prominent suspects in the case. Frank Jones, who was a Villisca resident and Iowa State senator. Josiah had worked for Jones at his implement store for years before leaving to open his own business, and notably, taking the lucrative John Deere dealership contract with him when he went. Jones held a deep grudge. One theory is that Jones hired a man named William Mansfield, known as Insane Blackie, to carry out the murders. Mansfield was an ex-convict with a violent history and was linked by circumstance to a string of axe murders in Colorado Springs, Palo, Kansas, and later in Illinois. The Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City considered him their prime suspect, but payroll records placed Mansfield in Illinois at the night of the Villisca murders. He was released and later sued the detective who accused him, and he won. Now here's another one. Paul Mueller is a compelling suspect, and the suspect in most people's minds who have studied this case. Paul was a German immigrant, drifter, and logger who was the subject and theory put forward in 2017 by journalist and author Bill James and his daughter Rachel in their book, The Man from the Train. Mueller was a suspect in a series of similar murders across the Midwest and beyond, cases that shared key details with Villisca, including the targeting of young girls and the covering of mirrors. James built a compelling case on circumstantial evidence, but without physical proof, and with all of that evidence tampered with, it just remained a theory. One of the most compelling arguments against Paul was when the neighbors saw him walking to the train on the night of the murders and called out for him. He didn't respond. Despite the disturbing parallels, no physical evidence has ever conclusively tied Mueller to the Villisca murders, leaving the theory unresolved and heavily debated among true crime historians and investigators. Henry Lee Moore is another name thrown out there. No relation to the family. He was convicted months after the Villisca murders for killing his own mother and grandmother with an axe. He was suspected of being a serial killer responsible for multiple similar crimes across the Midwest. The similarities were hard to ignore, but he was never formally charged in connection with Villisca. Now here's a familiar name who was accused, who we spoke about last season. After the 1892 Lizzie Borden murder trials, many people viewed John Morse as secretive and suspicious. He also had connections to Iowa and ties to the region, which fueled speculation after the Villisca axe murders. However, it was later revealed that John Morse died 3 months before the Villisca murders even took place, officially eliminating him as a suspect. But the most compelling argument comes in the form of a peeping Tom. Someone with a known history of waiting, watching, and who actually confessed to the murders. Reverend Lynn George Kelly, an English-born traveling minister who had come to Villisca specifically for the Children's Day program, the same program the Moores attended on the night of the murders. He had a disturbing background. He had suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent, was known as a peeper and arson, and had reportedly asked multiple women and girls to pose nude for him. He left Villisca on the 519 train the morning of June 10th, hours before the bodies were officially discovered, and reportedly told fellow passengers on that train that 8 people had been murdered in Villisca with nobody telling him prior. Kelly later confessed to the murders in court, claiming a demon made him do it. Seems like something we've seen before. But 2 separate juries didn't believe him. The first trial was a hung jury. The second trial was acquittal. He walked, and he claimed the confessions were coerced. Kelly eventually moved from the Midwest to New England, where his behavior grew more unstable over time. At one point, he served as a chaplain for the New Jersey chapter of the KKK, even delivering prayers before cross burnings. He died in 1959 at the age of 80 years too long, at Islip Hospital in New York, a well-known psychiatric institution at the time, and was buried alongside his wife in Woodland Cemetery in the Bronx. Over a century later, no one has officially been held accountable. The case sits open in the cold case files in Iowa history, one of the most overanalyzed and least resolved murders the state has ever produced. Every thread eventually frays before it ties anything shut.
Right back after this crucial break.
The Villisca Axe Murder House occupies a different cultural lane than most haunted locations, and that's worth acknowledging before we go any further here. They claim to not advertise the murders, and most of it is spread by word of mouth. But I think the big sign outside that says Villisca Axe Murder House does a fine job. Not to mention all of the targeted Facebook ads. Most haunted house stories carry some version of the same uncertainty we talked about in the Sallie house episode. Was there really a death? Did someone really suffer here? The documentation is thin. The legend grew to fill in the gaps, and somewhere between history and mythology, the story became unverifiable. Villisca has no such ambiguity. The murders actually happened. The victims were real. Their names are documented. Their graves are in the Villisca cemetery. Reverend Kelly is buried only 30 minutes from where I sit right now. The trial records themselves exist. The newspaper coverage from 1912 exists. The evidence, the photos, all of it is real. All of it is there. This is not a story that was handed down in whispers and embellished over time. It is an archived historical tragedy that the entire town of Villisca, the state of Iowa, and ultimately the entire country pretty much knows about. Now here's where we have to be honest with what we're dealing with and how it differs from every other case we'll cover this season. The grief was real. The trauma was real. Everything I just said about this case was so gruesome because it was so real. Whether something like that can leave an imprint on a physical space, that's where the conversation becomes more complicated and where we're headed next. The horror already existed long before a single camera crew arrived. The camera simply just pointed at it. Now what we know is those cigarette butts that were found in the attic were never DNA tested, despite the technology eventually making that possible. There was also a watch fragment that was found in the girl's bedroom, but never matched anybody. The modern tools of true crime investigation, forensic genealogy, advanced DNA profiling, all of it, have never been fully applied to this case with complete access to the remaining evidence. There has been renewed interest in doing so, but as of this episode right now, the murders still remain unresolved, and perhaps they want it that way. Now from the paranormal side, the questions are different but just as unresolved. And the transformation from the true crime landmark to paranormal destination has its own complicated history. For most of the 20th century, the house was simply just preserved as the site of one of the darkest moments in Iowa history. It passed through multiple owners before historian Darwin Lynn and Martha Lynn purchased it in 1994 and spent years restoring it to its 1912 appearance. They removed modern renovations, they stripped out the plumbing and electricity, and turned the home into a historically accurate time capsule of the crimes committed. The house was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1998. Today, the house sits almost exactly as it did in 1912. No electricity, no plumbing, very little modern intrusion. Investigators who study residual hauntings, the theory that traumatic events can leave an imprint on a location that replays over and over again under the right conditions, consider the Villisca Axe Murder House one of the best preserved environments of its kind in the country because it's all stripped down. 8 violent deaths in a single night, nearly every room touched by violence. A building carefully maintained in its original state for over a century. If residual energy can attach itself to places, this is exactly the kind of place believers argue it would attach to. Now, whether you believe that or not, something continues to bring serious investigators back, and the experiences they report, they're not usually minor. Now that changes the weight of the story. When you watch a dramatized retelling of the Villisca murders, that fiction is not whether something happened. We know 8 people were murdered in that house. The fiction, when it exists, lies in the why and the who. The first documented paranormal investigation did not take place until 1999. After that, the floodgates opened. Ghost adventures came, the BuzzFeed crew came, YouTubers eventually came, and unlike cases such as the Sallie house, where dramatized retellings often added fictional layers to an already disputed story, the Villisca investigations were built on something undeniable. Does that make the paranormal claims more credible? That's the question we're about to find out. Having no electricity is one of the biggest deals when it comes to exploring this home. That means no interference from copper wires, telephone lines, or any technology. An EMF reading here is most likely to come from something lingering or the cell phone in your pocket. But it also means when it gets dark out there in southwestern Iowa and the door closes behind you, it goes completely dark. No light switches, no ambient glow from appliances. You brought everything you need, or you have nothing. And in that kind of dark, with that kind of history pressing in on you from all four walls, the house has a way of communicating whether you want it to or not. Like I mentioned, the first formal paranormal investigation took place in 1999. A team set up sensitive microphones and infrared cameras throughout the house, and they stayed the night. They reported unexplained noises and captured what they described as a small glowing orb on the camera. Something one investigator described as borderline demonic in nature and distinctly non-human. That team declared the house haunted and importantly said they believed they had made contact with something other than the victims. That distinction, that whatever is in the Villisca house may or may not only be the Moore family, has echoed through every investigation since. Now, as usual, there are some familiar names who have brought this house into the forefront of paranormal, I'll say, entertainment. Now, first up is Jack Osborne, who is actually a great asset to the paranormal field, with multiple shows and a deep respect for the locations he visits, and is listed on the Villisca Axe Murder website as one of the most notable investigators who has brought the property national attention. His years of paranormal work across multiple Travel Channel series has consistently brought him to heavyweight locations, even with his dad Ozzy, and Villisca is very much in that category. Now, Ghost Adventures just couldn't keep their hands off the place. They brought Zach Baggins, Nick Groff, and Aaron Goodwin to Villisca for Season 4 of the series, which aired in 2010. This was an early episode, and Villisca was already considered one of the heaviest locations they had tackled to that point. The attic, where the killer hid before the murders, became the focal point of their investigation. The accounts from that episode described the attic as distinctly different from the rest of the house. It felt heavier, more oppressive, the kind of room that sits wrong on you even after nothing obviously happens. Ghost Adventures returned to the evidence on a later Aftershock special, revisiting what they captured during that initial lockdown.
I want to see if I can give her some kind of closure by you speaking to me right now. Do you recognize Linda? All right, we'll review this audio.
If I can give her some kind of closure by you speaking to me right now.
What is that?
That's a voice.
Now, Sam and Colby, we mentioned last week, visited this house right before they visited the Sallie house. And they got some interesting information, which we mentioned involved the basement of the Sallie house and Johnny Hauser from Villisca. This episode is from December of 2021, and regardless of how you feel about Sam and Colby, I think it's worth going to watch, regardless of how you feel about the two. Not only for the activity they find, or whether you believe it or not, but they speak with Rachel James, who is the author of the book that accused Mueller. She has her own theories, but also Johnny Hauser gives a full, in-depth walkthrough of his experience as well as the history of the house. They came in with real intent in trying to understand the case, not just chase evidence, but actually sit with the history. They sat in that attic and they experienced some strange things, not to mention possible contact with Mueller.
Was it Paul? Do you know Paul?
Yes.
You know Paul? Paul Miller.
Yeah. We're talking about it.
Yeah, we're talking about Paul
Right
Miller.
there.
So
I enjoyed it.
Oh my God.
Did you make Paul do it?
If I was him,
the spirit wanted to do it. I enjoyed it if I was him.
yes.
Villisca is a hotbed of paranormal investigations. Kelsey Davies, Project Fear, Paranormal Files, Haunted Nights, BuzzFeed Unsolved, you name it, and they've been there. Now there's one incident at the Villisca house that doesn't fit neatly into any of the investigation categories and deserves its own mention, because it's one of the most disturbing documented events in modern history of the property. In November of 2014, a man arrived at the house for what was described as a recreational paranormal investigation. The caretaker, Johnny Hauser, warned him not to bring his hunting knife inside. He brought it anyway. At around 12:45 in the morning, which investigators note is the approximate time the murders are believed to have begun in 1912, his partner found him alone in the northwest bedroom, stabbed in the chest, apparently self-inflicted. He had no memory of doing it. He was airlifted to Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha. He survived and later returned to the house and apologized for his behavior. No one has ever been able to clearly explain what happened to him in that room. And then there's the train. Every night around 2 a.m, a train passes through Villisca, just like it did in 1912. You can hear the whistle from the house, and investigators and overnight guests consistently report that the 2 a.m. train seems to trigger something, that the residual activity picks up around that time, that the house feels different in the minutes after the whistle passes. Some researchers believe it has to do with the timing of the original murders, which also occurred in those early morning hours. Whether it's the sound, the timing, or something else entirely, it's been noted independently by enough visitors that it's become part of the documented pattern of this location. What the evidence says, taken together, is something harder to dismiss than any singular account on its own. Voices captured in rooms that were empty, cold spots in specific areas, particularly the attic. Objects moving, the psychological weight of the house, noted not just by believers, but by skeptics who came in specifically to challenge the narrative and left quieter than they arrived. The guest room downstairs where Lena and Ina Stillinger were killed is consistently described as the heaviest room in the house. And once again back to the attic, the room where the killer waited, is described by almost everyone who goes up there as deeply, specifically wrong in a way that most investigators struggle to articulate. The house is there, it's still open, still dark at night, and by most accounts, still very much active. Should I visit? Leave a comment and let me know. Part of why this story refuses to leave is that justice was never delivered. And that's the kind of thing that sits in the soil of a place like this. Whether or not you believe in the residual energy, you kind of understand the weight of the unresolved grief. Villisca has been carrying it since 1912, and it hasn't gotten any lighter. There is also something specific about the way the house was preserved. When Darwin and Martha Lynn restored it to its 1912 condition in the 90s, they made a decision that most historical preservation efforts don't make. They don't just keep the structure, they stripped it back, period-appropriate furnishings. The house that investigators and visitors walk into today is as close as it is possible to get into the house that existed on that June night. That level of preservation is rare. Hopefully something like this is what we see with the Conjuring house in the near future. But it also means that when people report experiences there, they are reporting them in a context that has been deliberately kept as close to the original as possible. There are fewer variables, no electricity, no modern intrusion. The house is what it was, and that makes what happened inside it harder to explain away. The town itself is also part of the narrative. Villisca is small, just over 2,000 people as of today. The history of the Moore family murders is essentially woven into the identity of the community. The house is on a regular residential street. The cemetery where the victims are buried is down the road. The Presbyterian church, where the family spent their last evening together, is still there. This is not a story that has been relocated to a museum or a tourist tourist destination. It exists inside the town the way the town has always existed, and you feel that way when you're there. And then there's the simple, hard truth of 8 people who went to sleep expecting to wake up that morning. That's the thing that gets you if you let it. Not the EVPs, not the cold spots, not the attic or the covered mirrors or the train whistling at 2 a.m. It's the image of the 5-year-old in his bed, or the 2 girls who were just having a sleepover, or a family who walked home from church on a summer night and never knew that someone was already upstairs waiting. You don't have to believe in anything paranormal to find the Villisca house deeply, thoroughly unsettling. You only have to remember what actually happened there, and the house, standing exactly as it stood that night, will never let you forget. Through all of this, the investigations continue. Researchers continue. The cold case remains open, and the house on that Iowa street continues to receive visitors who come for different reasons. Some for the ghost stories, some for the true crime, some for reasons they can't fully explain even to themselves. All of them walk out different than the way they walked in. The Villisca Axe Murder House is not the most famous haunted location in America. It's not the one with the Hollywood franchise or the icon that everyone recognizes on a t-shirt. What it is the most honest one. The grief inside is not a legend. The people inside it were real. The injustice that attached itself to those walls in 1912 is documented, verifiable, and completely unresolved. If the dead can linger in places where their stories were left unfinished, then Villisca has every reason to be haunted, whether the lights flicker or not. In the next episode, we're heading into a place where the past doesn't sit quietly. It pushes back. The Bellaire House. Tucked into a small Ohio River town, this 1800s home has built a reputation that goes way beyond your typical ghost story. People don't just say it's haunted, they say it's hostile. Reports of being scratched, hearing voices with no source, and objects moving on their own have turned this house into one of the homes scattered across the small river towns of the Midwest. Brick foundation, pitched roof, old windows that let the light shine through. But the people who have been inside it, lived in it, investigated it, tried to sleep in it, describe something that goes well beyond a drafty old house. They describe something that pushes back. The Bellaire House at 1699 Belmont Street has a reputation built on layers of history, some documented, some disputed, but layers of paranormal claims, some that stand up to the scrutiny, some that don't. And underneath all of it, the kind of place that makes people feel things they can't easily explain and can't easily dismiss. Unlike the Villisca Axe Murder House, there is no single night of documented horror at the center of this story. No crime scene photos, no inquest records, no 8 people whose names are carved in a cemetery just down the road. What the Bellaire House has instead is something far more complicated. A convergence of history, geography, grief, and accumulated experiences that researchers, believers, and skeptics alike keep returning to try to make sense of. That complexity is exactly why we're here. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Bellaire, Ohio sits on the eastern edge of the state, pressed up against the Ohio River where it runs along the border of West Virginia. It's the kind of town that grew because of industry and held on after industry left. The Central Ohio Railway helped build it into something real in the 1800s. Coal built a lot of the wealth, and that same coal, the mines dug deep into the hills above the river, left something behind that nobody in Bellaire has fully stopped talking about. The town was actually renamed by the railroad company to Bellaire. The name sounds like it ought to mean something French and elegant. And then you see the terrain, the hills dropping down to the river, the old industrial bones of the place, the sense that the ground here has been worked and reworked for a very long time. And you understand that the prettiness is only a surface thing. Now there is a house on Belmont Street. It was built in the mid-1800s and it has passed through enough hands, absorbed enough of the history, and collected enough reported experience over the last 2 decades that the paranormal community has placed it in the same conversation as the Amityville House, the La Laurie Mansion, and some of the most heavily documented locations in the country. Whether it belongs in that conversation is genuinely complicated, and we're going to try to get into why. But because the Bellaire House is not a case of documented tragedy waiting to be explained, it is something harder. It's a location where the history itself is partly in dispute, where the paranormal claims are substantial and specific, and where the honest answer to almost every major question is, we don't fully know. Now, to understand the Bellaire House, you have to understand the land that it sits on, and with the man who built it. Jacob Hetherington was a coal mining tycoon, one of the most powerful businessmen in the Ohio Valley in the 1800s. He owned coal mine number 1, and most of the mines operating in the region at the time came under his control at some point. He built the house at what it is now 1699 Belmont Street, and according to the history documented by the current owner, he built it near Shawnee Native American burial caves. Caves that sit close to the Ohio River and that various researchers have argued represented a significant concentration of geographic and spiritual energy. The Ohio River itself is central to the story in ways that go beyond simple geography. Before European settlers arrived, the river valley had been home to several Native American tribes, including the Mingo, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. The French and Indian Wars played out in the same landscape. A young George Washington surveyed land in the Ohio River Valley before the Revolutionary War. The ground here has memory attached to it. How much of that memory bleeds into the physical spaces built on top is one of the questions that researchers have been wrestling with at this location for many years. When Jacob Hetherington died, the house passed down through the family. One of his sons, Alexander, took over the business and continued living there, but the pressure and the stress eventually took a toll on him. In late December of 1887, Alexander was committed to the Athens Lunatic Asylum. After that, his daughter Lyd assumed control of both the family business and the house, alongside her brothers Jacob and Edwin, who are also still living there. Lyd remained in the home for decades until her death on April 6, 1947, at the age of 85, reportedly from acute myocardial failure. According to locals, she died in the first floor room just inside the front door. You'll never guess what that room is known for now. Grief does things to people. Lyd's brother Edwin became obsessed with reaching his sister from the other side. He turned to spiritualism. He brought in mediums. He studied the occult and reportedly worked to develop his own psychic abilities in an attempt to make contact with her. And according to the theory that has attached itself to this location, Edwin didn't just grieve. He opened something. The accounts of what came through and what stayed are extensive. The house's current owner, Kristen Lee, describes multiple portals within the structure. One connected to the coal mine below, one created by the convergence of the Ohio River's energy and the nearby burial caves, and others attributed to the decades of Edwin's attempts to reach his dead sister. In her books and in interviews, she has described the house as sitting on ley lines, one of the described lines of concentrated earth energy that researchers have traced through alignments of ancient sites, which she argues created a constant and self-replenishing source of paranormal activity, regardless of how many cleansings or exorcisms have been performed inside. There is also the coal mines. In 1893, an explosion at the mines below the town killed 42 men. The Bellaire house, according to official history of the property, sits directly above what was designated coal mine number 1, the same mine at the center of Jacob Hetherington's empire. The deaths underground, the grief above ground, the decades of Edwin's occult experiments in the rooms, in the hallways of the house. The theory, as it has been built layer by layer, is that these things compound each other. A literal fiery hell was burning underneath this home. The house also has a history of servants. Multiple women named Mary employed in the home over the years, according to local accounts. One particular piece of the story documented on the official Bellaire House website describes a servant's child who was lured into the attic window and fell to his death. That tragedy is said to have happened more than once. And in more recent history, at least one adult male investigator reportedly felt the same pull towards that same window during an overnight stay. A compulsion he struggled to explain and resist. The most recent layer of formal documented history concerns another Hetherington descendant. Commitment papers uncovered by Kristen Lee and a colleague named Rebecca Gardner described Alex Hetherington's decline into what was diagnosed at the time as non-compos mentis, which means not of sound mind. The records describe Alex wandering the banks of the Ohio River, believing he was on the boat to Wellsburg, West Virginia. They describe partial paralysis, deteriorating mental stability, and a final order from probate judge Isaac Gaston, committing Alex to the Athens Asylum for the Insane in Athens, Ohio. Whether his breakdown was connected to the house or simply to the collapse of his business is something that records don't answer. But the image of another Hetherington deteriorating in proximity to this property is one that researchers keep coming back to. That is the history that has been assembled over the years, and it's important to say here that not all of it is equally verified.
Right back. Crucial break.
The Bellaire house occupies an interesting position in the paranormal landscape, and it's one that complicates the conversation in ways worth acknowledging. At Villisca, the pop culture machinery had something incontestable to work with. 8 murders, a real crime scene, a real family. The dramatizations could embellish the edges, but they couldn't invent the center. This one is similar to the Sallie house, because at the Bellaire house, the situation is more fluid. The history assembled by Kristen Lee has been the foundation of every television segment, every investigation, every book and podcast that has covered the same location. And because significant portions of that history have not been independently verified, and some of it has been actively challenged by skeptical researchers, there's a genuine question about how much of the current narrative is supported by solid ground and how much has been layered on top of the original structure the way renovations sometimes cover up old bones. That is not a reason to dismiss the experiences people report here. Experience is not invalidated by a contested backstory. If someone walks into the Bellaire house with minimal knowledge of the official history and still reports being physically affected, still records unexplained audio, still feels the pull in the attic that every investigator consistently describes, that carries weight regardless of whether Edwin Hetherington really opened up 11 portals or only 2. What pop culture has done with the Bellaire house is take the most dramatic version of each layer, the most portals, the most ancient energy lines, the most demonic characterization of what is inside, and amplify it for entertainment. That's what pop culture does. We've seen it many times here. The honest version of the Bellaire house, which is what we're after here, is a place with a real and complicated history, a real and complicated owner who built a real and complicated mythology around it, and a set of reported experiences that serious investigators, not just the entertainment-driven ones, have found genuinely difficult to explain away. And that honest version is more interesting than the amplified one. Now here's where we have to be careful. Like I just mentioned, unlike other locations, the Bellaire house situation is different. The core tragedy is layered, some of it documented in historical records, some of it assembled by the current owner through research that has been contested, and some of it built on claims that skeptical investigators have been unable to independently verify. A comprehensive investigation of the property published by the Skeptical Inquirer examined the official history, and they found a few gaps. The claim that the house has been steeped in paranormal activity since the early 20th century was not supported by any written account predating Kristen Lee's purchase of the house in 2005. The property changed hands multiple times between 1963 and 2005. Records of alleged paranormal activity from that period are thin or non-existent. Neighbors during the years the house sat empty before Lee's purchase reported seeing figures in the window. But that kind of account can attach itself to any unoccupied building in a small town with enough history. The Skeptical Inquirer's investigation also found that some of the historical figures cited in the official Bellaire house narrative did not match what census records actually showed. But here's the other side of that, and it matters just as much. Contested or partially constructed history does not automatically mean nothing is happening inside a building. The Bellaire house raises a genuine difficult version of a question that comes up at many paranormal locations. How much of what investigators experience is shaped by the story they were told before they walked in? And how much of what they experience has nothing to do with the story? The coal mine explosion in 1893 was real. 42 men died in those hills. Edwin Hetherington's grief and his turn towards spiritualism are part of the documented record. The commitment of Alex Hetherington is documented. The structure itself, old, built into a hill, positioned near a river that has flooded and shifted and carried the dead of the region for centuries, is real. Whether any of that creates what investigators consistently report inside those walls is the question that honest research has not been able to answer. What is also real is this: the house has driven multiple owners and renters out. Kristen Lee moved her family in and moved them back out by 2009. She then tried renting it, and tenants didn't stay. Not because they were warned the house was haunted, but because things kept happening that they couldn't tolerate. She eventually made the decision that no family should live there. She converted it into an afterlife research center and began inviting paranormal investigating teams from across the country and beyond. That choice, and what has happened in the house since, is where the documented record becomes considerably richer. And now it's time for my favorite part. The Bellaire house is described consistently by investigators who arrive with every level of skepticism as a place that makes you feel watched before anything happens. Kristen Lee's own experience, the one that ended with her family's departure, began with what she called an oppressive feeling that moved through the house at night. It escalated. The family dog was thrown against the wall. Lee herself was held down in her bed. She described seeing a gray apparition lean over her as she laid on the couch, a figure that turned and walked away slowly, fading before it disappeared entirely. She has since referred to this entity as the Gray Man and is one of the most frequently reported presences in the house. The initial response to these events was to reach out to the Ohio Valley Paranormal Research Investigations, who were among the first to formally document activity at the property. The attic at the Bellaire house is, by consistent independent accounts, the room that most investigators feel the most difficult. The same is true at the Villisca house, the attic being a focal point of the wrongness that people feel before they could even articulate it. At Bellaire, the attic is the room connected to the servant's child, to the strange pull in the window, and to one of the most disturbing recent accounts in the property's history. Cloud in the shape of a snake, moving past their feet in a slow, deliberate loop, retreating into the dark and returning. She said she pulled her feet up. She said if someone told her this story before she saw it, she would have thought they were lying. Now, Brandy Fulkerson and Nicole Wilson, a team who have returned to the Bellaire house repeatedly over the years and whose experiences were featured on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, have documented a range of phenomena. On one occasion, they were monitoring the house from the main floor while watching cameras covering the upstairs room when they observed an unexplained light in one of the bedrooms, a light that responded to their verbal requests, flickering on and off until it went dark and everything went quiet. On another occasion, they captured what they described as audio of two separate voices in apparent conversation with each other, an EVP recording that, if taken at face value, represents something considerably more unusual than a single word or breath captured on a recorder. Skeptics have raised the reasonable possibility of radio frequency interference, which is always a legitimate concern with audio equipment in a house that close to a river and a populated area. The debate over that recording has never been resolved. Now let's get into the more mainstream investigations. Paranormal Lockdown brought Nick Groff and Katrina Weidman to Bellaire for a 72-hour investigation. Their full lockdown format, the most extended kind of investigation their methodology allows. They were joined by George Brown, the inventor of the GeoBox Spirit Box and the Geoport devices, and by Steve Huff, the creator of the Portal Wonderbox. The combination of extended time and multiple sophisticated communication instruments produced what the team described as terrifying results, including voices captured on equipment that both Nick and Katrina found deeply unsettling. In one of the most discussed moments from the investigation, voices recorded in the attic were described as not only present, but threatening, specifically directing language at Nick and Katrina in ways that felt intentional and targeted rather than just ambient.
I'm gonna turn this device up. Whatever you want to say to us, come through and communicate. Are you affecting our bodies right now? Are you trying to use our bodies to communicate?
Yeah.
It goes yes.
The Paranormal Lockdown team considered it one of the most significant pieces of captured evidence. Nick Groff has revisited the footage in interviews and maintained that position. BuzzFeed Unsolved came to the Bellaire house for an episode titled The Demonic Bellaire House, which aired in 2018 in season 4 of the series. Ryan and Shane brought their familiar dynamic, the genuine believer and the committed skeptic, and the house, as it tends to do, had different things to say to each of them. Kristen Lee was their guide through the property. The Spirit Box session in that episode produced what became one of the more discussed BuzzFeed Unsolved moments from a purely strange resulted standpoint, even if the responses themselves were fragmented.
Emily, if you're here, say something.
Emily, is that you?
And of course, Shane was not visibly moved during the experience, though it's worth noting that he later admitted in an interview that when Lee told him the story of her dog being thrown against the wall, his immediate, private thought was that she had thrown the dog herself. He kept that to himself on camera out of politeness. That kind of candor is something this podcast respects. Though, I'm not sure Kristen Lee actually threw a dog. The Bellaire house has since been the subject of a feature film, the Bellaire House movie, The Hetherington Family, released on Tubi and produced in collaboration with Lee and a descendant of the Hetherington family, surprisingly with decent ratings. The property has also been covered by John Zaffis, one of the most experienced paranormal investigators in the country with more than 35 years of field work, also Lorraine Warren's nephew, and visited by Bishop James Long, an exorcist in the Old Catholic Church, who performed the minor rite of exorcism inside the building. Bishop Long has said publicly that the Bellaire house is one of the most active locations he has ever investigated, while John Zaffis, who does not say this casually, described the house as genuinely haunted and said it still held secrets after his visit. And now this is where the property begins to get physical. A staff member carrying equipment down the stairs felt a strong tug on his clothing and stumbled. Objects have moved in ways that witnesses found impossible to attribute to drafts or structural settling. And while I like watching all of these investigations with an open mind, some things like to stand out at me. Sam and Colby's visit was riddled with controversy involving Seth Borden and some comments made off-screen that were monitored by Kristen Lee. But besides that, there were moments in their investigation where investigator Mike McAllister walked off screen, says he had a full conversation with the demon, then walked back on screen with a light scratch on his back. What a crazy coincidence it happened off screen. And then there is a simple, durable fact that multiple families and individuals have been driven out of this house. Not just spooked, not unsettled, they were driven out. They left. And that distinction matters. Some hauntings happen in old houses all the time. You get a little scared, and you might stay. But getting to the point where a family packs up their belongings and actually leaves, and then, when you try to rent the house, watching new renters also leave, that's something that deserves more than just a shrug.
Right back. Crucial break.
The Bellaire house keeps pulling people back for reasons that are worth examining separately from the individual claims. Part of it is the geography. The Ohio River Valley has a weight to it that you feel whether or not you're looking for the paranormal. The hills, the river, the sense of industrial history pressing up through the ground. The region was contested land for centuries. Native Americans, French, British, American, and the physical landscape still carries some of that density. Whether that translates into anything that can be measured on a K2 meter is a different question. But the sense of it is there, and it affects how people experience being in the spaces built on top of it. Part of it is the coal mine below, and the deaths associated with it, the proximity to the river, the reported ley lines, the burial caves. Any single one of those elements could make for a moderately interesting location. All of them together in one spot with a documented history of human grief and occult experimentation layered on top. That is a different kind of proposition. The other part of it is what happened to the people who lived here. When the story of a haunted house is built on one family's experience, there's always a reasonable question about what that family brought with them, or what they believed walking in. When multiple unrelated families and individuals over a span of years in a rotating succession report similar experiences and leave without prompting, that pattern is harder to attribute purely to psychology. And part of it is Kristen Lee herself. Whatever you make of the contested portion of the official history she has built around the property, she is an undeniably central figure in why the Bellaire house exists in the public conversation the way it does. She moved in, she was driven out, she stayed connected to the building. She made a decision to transform it rather than abandon it, to turn it into a research center rather than sell it to someone else and let them figure it out. That decision brought Nick Groff and Katrina Weidman. It brought Ryan and Shane. It brought John Zaffis and Bishop Long and hundreds of independent teams from across the country and beyond. The story exists at the scale it does because she chose to make it accessible rather than seal it up. There is something in that choice worth recognizing. The Bellaire house is not a crime scene preserved for historical record the way Villisca has been. It is a living space, or whatever the right word is for what it currently is. And that has been deliberately open to anyone willing to spend a night in the dark trying to understand it. Whether what's inside deserves that understanding or whether it welcomes it is still being answered by every team that walks through the door. We started the season at the Sallie house. The grief was real, the experiences were real, but the specific girl at the center of it existed in that uncertain territory between documented history and legend. We went from there to Villisca, where the dead were absolutely real. Their names were on headstones, their murders were in the newspapers, the crimes were incontestable, and the only mystery was in the who. That certainly gave everything at Villisca a different kind of weight. But the Bellaire house sits in its own category, one that doesn't map neatly onto either of those. The history is real and partly in dispute. The experiences are documented by serious investigators and also by people with a vested interest in a particular story. The entities reported inside the house are described as not only the Hetherington family, not only residual grief and loss, but something older, something that has been there before the house and may continue regardless of what happens to the building. That possibility, if it is taken seriously rather than dismissed, is arguably the most unsettling version of this story. The house at 1699 Belmont Street is still standing, still open, still accepting investigators, overnight guests, and anyone willing to sit in the dark on that Ohio hillside and see what comes to sit with them. Most people leave with questions. Some leave faster than they planned to. And a small number, like Kristen Lee herself, find that leaving doesn't quite end it the way they hoped it would. In the next episode, we're heading all the way to California, to one of the oldest and most genuinely layered haunted locations in the American West. The Whaley House in San Diego was built in 1857 by Thomas Whaley on a site that had already seen a public hanging. It became a courthouse, a store, a theater, a family home, and eventually a building the U.S. Commerce Department officially recognized as one of the most haunted places in the country. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. There is a house in Old Town San Diego that has been called the most haunted house in America for so long that the title has started to feel like wallpaper. Travel Channel said it. Life magazine said it. The U.S. Commerce Department put it in writing. Hundreds of thousands of visitors have walked through its front doors every year for decades, and a significant portion of them have walked back out with something they couldn't fully explain. But here's what separates it from almost everything we've covered so far in this series. The man who built it attended the public execution and then came back and built his family home on the same ground where the scaffold had stood. He moved his wife and children in, and from the very first week, the family started hearing heavy footsteps in rooms where no one was walking. Thomas Whaley knew what that land was, and he chose it anyway. That decision and everything that followed from it is what we're here to talk about today. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Old Town San Diego is the kind of place where history is visible on the surface. Adobe buildings, brick facades, cobblestone streets worn smooth by a century and a half of foot traffic. It's the oldest settled European neighborhood in California, and if you spend enough time walking its streets, you can feel the layering of it, the way the 1850s sits just underneath the tourist shops and the tour guides. At 2476 San Diego Avenue, there is a house that holds more of that history than any other building in the city. It was built in 1857 by Thomas Whaley, a New York businessman who had come west during the gold rush and decided San Diego was where he wanted to plant himself. The house is Greek Revival in style, handsome, deliberate, the most elegant structure in Southern California when it was completed. It is the oldest brick building in the region. Thomas designed it himself, had the bricks fired in his own brickyard, and wrote proudly that when it was finished, it would be the finest, most comfortable home within 150 miles. He was right about that. The San Diego Herald called it the finest new brick block in Southern California. It was a mansion for its time and place. Mahogany and rosewood furniture, Brussels carpets, damask drapes, a house that said Thomas Whaley had arrived and intended to stay. Over the decade that followed, the house was everything a home in a growing city can be. A general store, San Diego's second county courthouse, the first commercial theater in the city, a family home through generations of Whaleys who lived there, grieved there, and several of them died there. The last Whaley to live inside, Corinne Lillian, passed away in 1953. The house opened as a museum in 1960. It has been receiving visitors and filing paranormal reports ever since. But the thing that has to be said before we get to any of that, the thing Thomas Whaley knew when he chose that specific piece of land, is what happened there 5 years before the house was built, before the Brussels carpets and the rosewood furniture and the 6 children who grew up inside those walls. A man was hanged there, and he didn't go quietly. And some researchers believe he never really left. In August of 1852, a man named James Robinson arrived in San Diego. He went by Yankee Jim, a name that conjures something between folklore and farce, which is part of why his story has stuck. He was 6'4" in an era where that height was genuinely remarkable. He came to town, immediately caused problems, and within months had been convicted of attempted grand larceny after trying to steal a boat from the harbor. When he went to trial for this crime and a bunch of others, the jury, which consisted of 2 of the boat's owners, sentenced him. The punishment was the gallows. Before he was hanged, a priest gave him a last-minute Catholic baptism and renamed him Santiago. Then all 6'4" of him was brought to a vacant lot in the Old Town Plaza, loaded onto a wagon and fitted with a noose. The wagon was pulled out from beneath him, and because of his height, because the gallows hadn't been built to account for a man this tall, the toes of Yankee Jim's boots scraped the ground. He didn't drop cleanly. He strangled slowly, his boots dragging in the dirt while the crowd just watched. Thomas Whaley was in that crowd. He watched Yankee Jim Robinson die on that ground. He remembered it well enough that years later, when he started hearing heavy footsteps in the upstairs hallway of the house that he built on the same spot, he knew immediately what he believed was making them. Now, Thomas and Anna Whaley moved into the house on August 22, 1857. Almost from the first week, Thomas reported hearing those footsteps. They were heavy, they were deliberate, and they were on the second floor when no one else was in the house. The footsteps were consistent enough and specific enough to the upper landing and the staircase that the family just talked about it openly. They knew about it. Thomas just knew that it was Yankee Jim. He had watched the man die on that land, and now he heard him walking in his house, and he seemed to accept that connection as the most logical explanation for what was happening. He didn't think anything else. That is where the Whaley house hauntings begin, with a builder who chose haunted ground with full knowledge of what made it that way. Perhaps that knowledge is what haunted Thomas all along. But the family tragedies came after. In January 1857, just months after moving in, the Whaley's youngest child, 18-month-old Thomas Whaley Jr., died of scarlet fever in the house. The loss, just compounded by a fire that destroyed their general store shortly after, it drove Thomas and Anna to San Francisco. They left the house. It sat. Thomas managed his affairs from a distance, turning the property over to the Wells Fargo agent, and for nearly a decade, the house stood without its family inside. They came back in 1868. Thomas refurbished the house, reopened his store. He brought Anna and the children back home to San Diego. Life resumed inside those walls. The house also became the county courthouse for a time. The county paid Thomas $65 a month to rent the courthouse and 3 upstairs bedrooms. It hosted the first commercial theater in San Diego, a room that was fitted out with a stage and managed to fit 150 guests in a space that was never designed for it. It was so tight that the ladies were advertised not to wear their hooped skirts because there was just no room. And then on January 5th, 1882, both of Thomas and Anna's daughters were married on the same day inside the house. Violet Eloise, at 19, married a man named George T. Bertolacci. Her sister, Anna Amelia, married their first cousin, John T. Whaley, in the same ceremony. For Violet, the marriage was over almost before it began. Shortly after the wedding, a letter arrived. Bertolacci confessed that he had married Violet under false pretenses. He was a con artist who had targeted the Whaley family's money. He was not who he claimed to be. Thomas and Anna tried to sever all contact between their daughter and her husband, but Violet sank deeper and deeper into a lasting depression. She spent more and more time isolated on the second floor of the house, and on August 19th, 1885, at the age of only 22, Violet Whaley went to the back of the house, took her father's .32 caliber pistol, and shot herself in the chest. The note she left was a passage from a Thomas Hood poem that Edgar Allan Poe had once cited in his lectures on writing. It read, "Mad from life's history, swift to death's mystery, glad to be hurled anywhere, anywhere, out of this world." The scandal destroyed more than just Violet. Her sister Corinne Lillian had been engaged at the time. Her fiancé broke off the engagement when the news of Violet's suicide became public. The family never quite recovered. Thomas built a new house downtown for his family, and they left the Whaley house vacant for more than 2 decades once again. He died in 1890. Anna died in 1913. Their son Francis restored the house in 1909 and moved back in, eventually trying to turn it into a tourist attraction, posting signs about the history, playing guitar for visitors, leaning into the story rather than away from it. The family trickled back. Corinne Lillian, the last Whaley child, lived in the house until her death in 1953. By then, the ghost stories had already been a part of the Whaley house for nearly a century.
Right back after this commercial break.
Most haunted locations have 1 or 2 central figures attached to them. The Whaley house has an entire population, and they have been described with enough consistency, in enough detail, by enough unrelated witnesses across enough decades that they constitute something closer to a documented pattern than just a rumor. Yankee Jim Robinson is the oldest and the most feared legend. The heavy footsteps reported by Thomas from the first days in the house have been reported by visitors ever since. The accounts are specific about the location, the staircase, the upper landing, the stretch of hallway that sits over the spot where the gallows once stood. Some visitors report a feeling of pressure on the 9th step of the staircase, very specific, repeatable sensation that has been described independently often enough that the 9th step has its own entry in the documented history of the house. Others report a sensation of choking or constriction near the parlor area, in the vicinity of the old gallows site. Now, given how Yankee Jim died, strangling slowly with his boots dragging, that sensation is one that investigators, they just don't dismiss it easily. Thomas Whaley himself is one of the most frequently reported apparitions in the house. Witnesses over the decades have described a tall man in a coat and a top hat standing at the top of the staircase just looking down as if he's just surveying the house. Some researchers describe this as the most consistent apparition at the location. But here's another one. Some researchers describe this as the most consistent apparition at the location. A figure in a period dress at a specific spot, reported by witnesses who are unaware of previous experiences. Thomas is also said to occasionally blow the scent of tobacco smoke in the face of visitors, a habit that one tour guide had called rude, which I guess is fair. Now, Anna Whaley is reported in the parlor and the other downstairs rooms, typically described as wearing a green dress. Her presence has been reported not just by visitors, but by at least one San Diego police officer. A Whaley House tour guide named Victor Santana was setting the building's alarm one night when he heard a woman ask, "Why are you here?" He fled the building without completing the code and set off the alarm. The responding officer, once backup arrived, reported seeing a woman in a green dress standing in the parlor. By the time anyone could investigate further, she was gone. Now, a police officer on duty, responding to an alarm, reporting a woman in a dress standing in a locked building, is pretty big evidence. That's not a tourist claim, that is a documented incident by a police officer. But it doesn't end there. Violet is described most often in the upstairs rooms where she slept her final years. A sadness in specific spaces, a heaviness that visitors report feeling before they know whose rooms they're standing in. EVP sessions conducted in or near her room have produced results. Some investigators also hear a weeping sound. Others describe words that investigators just can't make out. Baby Thomas, who died in the house at 18 months, is said to be present in the rooms where he spent his short life. The sensation associated with his presence is described differently from the others, much lighter, quieter, and less oppressive. Some visitors report a sense of something small nearby without being able to articulate it further. And then there is a figure that sits outside of the main family narrative. A girl sometimes called Annabelle Washburn, said to have been a playmate of the Whaley children who died on the property after running into a clothesline in the yard. Now, researchers of this have been pretty honest. There is no historical record confirming Annabelle's existence. That's not the first time I've said that on this podcast. She may be a legend that attached itself to the house's reputation over time rather than a documented spirit. Her reported presence in the dining room is consistent enough that she gets mentioned in almost every account of the house. But the foundation for this one just might not be as honest as it is for the rest of the Whaley family members. But what is striking across all of these accounts is how specific they are. Not just, we saw a ghost, but they see a man in a specific coat and a top hat on top of the stairs. A woman in a green dress in the parlor. The pressure of the 9th step. The smell of cigar smoke. These are not vague reports. They are specific sensory claims that have been repeated over and over again for more than a century. The Whaley House has more of a complicated relationship with pop culture amplification than either the Villisca or the Bellaire house, because the house has been famous for long enough that the pop culture versions have started to feed each other in a loop. Life magazine's designation of most haunted house in America is one of the most cited facts about this house. but it's almost always cited without actual context, without noting when it appeared, under what framing, with what level of investigation. The Travel Channel named it the #1 most haunted location in the United States. The U.S. Commerce Department, in an act that remains one of the stranger moments in the history of federal designation, put the Whaley House's haunted status into an official document. What is it about this house that they just love so much? What that creates is a location where every single visitor arrives just preloaded with a story. They know about Yankee Jim. They know about Violet. They know about the footsteps on the stairs. And when they walk onto the 9th step and feel something, and the question of how much of what they feel is the house, and how much is the weight of 100 years of accumulated narrative pressing down on them, that question is genuinely difficult to answer. The honest version here is not that the accounts are fabricated. It's that the Whaley House has had enough time, enough witnesses, and enough pop culture reinforcement that separating signal from suggestion has become harder to do than at newer locations. What the television shows and the popular ghost investigations all share is that the house was producing specific, consistent results before those shows arrived and has continued producing them way after. The pop culture layer is real, but it sits on top of something that predates it by a century. Now here's the truth and what we know about this house. The historical record at the Whaley House is pretty solid. The tragedies are all documented, they all happen. The names are real, the court records, the newspaper coverage, the family chronology. It's all there. Baby Thomas's death certificate exists. Violet's note exists. The county courthouse lease agreement exists. This is not a location where the backstory has been assembled after the fact by a motivated owner. The history of this house was happening in the public, in a growing city, with journalists recording its every move for 100 years before anyone officially started calling it haunted. That matters a great deal for the same reason that Villisca matters differently than the Bellaire house. When the foundation of a haunting is made of documented stone, the reports of experiences that build on top of it carry a different kind of weight. There are a few specific elements of the Whaley story that deserve to be named directly, because they complicate the simple ghost tourism version of it. The first is Yankee Jim himself. The legend calls him a thief, and he was. In technical sense, he attempted to steal a boat, amongst many other things. But the punishment of hanging for attempted grand larceny, delivered by a community that has been in place for less than a year, to a man that has only recently arrived, says something about the rough and often arbitrary justice of frontier California. Researchers who have spent time with the documented history note that Yankee Jim was not an especially dangerous man. He was a nuisance and a petty criminal who was given an outsized punishment in front of a crowd. Whether or not his spirit has been walking up and down the stairs of a house for 170 years, the injustice of what happened to him on that ground is real and documented, and perhaps why he's still there. The second element worth naming is Violet. Her story is usually told as a ghost story first and a tragedy second. She was only 22 years old when she was deceived into marriage by a con artist, watched her family try to protect her while her social future just collapsed around her, and she spent the last years of her life isolated and depressed in the upper rooms of a house she could not seem to leave. The note she left was not theatrical. It was genuine anguish, borrowed from a poet who understood the desire to escape. The sadness of Violet Whaley is not a haunting premise. It's a real human life that ended badly in a specific room of a specific building, and that room just still exists, and the people still walk into it today. The third element is the sheer accumulation of independent, unconnected accounts spanning from 1857 all the way to the present. The Whaley family themselves reported paranormal activity while they were living in the house. Before there was any tourism value in doing so, before paranormal investigation was a category of entertainment, before ghost hunting equipment existed on eBay, Anna Whaley reported believing the house was cursed and responsible for the family's misfortunes. Corinne Lillian's descendants recounted that their great-grandmother's father had told her that Yankee Jim was hanging directly over the archway, separating the parlor from the study. A visitor in 1962 recounted that her family had been visiting the Whaleys years earlier, and her mother had been so disturbed by signs of Yankee Jim's ghost that they had to leave. These accounts all predate the museum and the television coverage. There were no ghost tours, and the 100,000 annual visitors who now pass through the door, some of them experienced the same thing. But that kind of pre-commercial documentation is very rare, and at the Whaley house, it goes back to the first family who lived there.
Right back after this crucial break.
I looked up and looked through the archway, and there was this image, illuminated in white. It was almost like a transparent shape of a woman, really, standing there.
Now, over the years, the Whaley house has attracted some serious paranormal investigators, and the body of evidence from those investigations is pretty substantial. Project Fear was able to get there only a few weeks ago. Now, we usually like to start with ghost adventures. This was Season 11, Episode 11 from 2014. Now, Zach Baggins, Nick Groff, and Aaron Goodwin have investigated some of the most significant paranormal locations in the country, and the Whaley house was waiting for them when they came to San Diego. The episode's official description cuts to the heart of what the team focused on. Built on top of former gallows, the belief that the spirit of Yankee Jim has been taking revenge on the living by choking and scratching visitors and investigators who enter. The choking phenomenon specific to Yankee Jim's territory in and near the parlor was something that the team took pretty seriously, given the documented history of how Yankee Jim died. But the most notable evidence from this episode came from an unexpected source. An investigator on the episode reported communicating with the ghost of George Whaley, one of Thomas and Anna's sons, through an ovulus, which is a device that uses electromagnetic fields to generate words as a form of spiritual communication. George is not the famous ghost of the Whaley house. He's not Yankee Jim, Violet, or Thomas. The idea that an ovulus would produce George's name unprompted in that specific location is just the kind of detail that sticks with you after you watch the episode. This is worth clipping and looking at closely if you want to dig into Ghost Adventures' experience from this location. And again, I always say this, listen and watch all of these accounts with a little bit of a grain of salt. They are entertainment after all.
So George Whaley is very active in the house. He loves to talk through the ovulus.
Okay.
Hi, George.
Oh, hi, George.
Whoa.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Now, in Season 1 in 2017, BuzzFeed Unsolved went to the Whaley house, and it earned over 12 million views on YouTube. And that kind of tells you something about how effective it was. We know Ryan and Shane's dynamic by now. One's the skeptic and one's the believer, and it works. Ryan arrived convinced that that house would have something to say, while Shane arrived equally convinced that it would not. The episode's most significant moment, and the one that has been discussed the most in years since, is pretty straightforward. Ryan was alone in the parlor, and he heard a whisper in his right ear from directly behind him. He stood up, he turned on his flashlight, but there was nobody there. If you've ever watched BuzzFeed Unsolved or Watcher, Ryan is a professional. He has been in a lot of dark rooms. We watched a sink turn on right in front of him on the Queen Mary. But whatever he heard in that parlor affected him in a way like we've never seen before. Now, in 2022, when Ryan and Shane formed Watcher Entertainment and launched Ghost Files as a successor to BuzzFeed Unsolved, one of their early investigations was to return to the Whaley house. Now, this one was a significantly higher production value and more sophisticated equipment than when they investigated last. More importantly, it brought 5 more years of experience between them. This is the investigation to watch if you want the most serious look at this house. There are countless more that include different theories, opening evil items, and bringing in mediums along the way. But this one's raw. This one tells it like it is. If you want the most current, Project Fear came out with an episode only 3 weeks ago investigating the Whaley house, which is also worth a watch. The Whaley house will just not stop being haunted, in the cultural sense at minimum, for the same reason that Villisca will not stop being a crime scene. The history is specific enough and the people inside it were real enough that the story refuses to abstract itself into pure legend. The physical continuity of the structure matters enormously. The Whaley house looks today the way it looked when the family lived there. The floors are the original floors. The rooms are the same rooms. The staircase with the 9th step is the same staircase. When investigators work in that building, they are working in the same physical space where Thomas heard footsteps in 1857, where Violet spent her last years in 1880, where Corinne Lillian died in 1953. That is not a reconstruction. That is not a replica. It is the house. There is also something specific about the geography that researchers keep coming back to. The Whaley house sits in a neighborhood that was the center of San Diego for half of the city's existence. The land it occupies has held executions, commerce, legal proceedings, theater, domestic life, death, grief, and 170 years of accumulated human weight. Whatever theory you hold on to about why certain locations seem to hold residual energy, traumatic imprinting, geological factors, the sheer density of concentrated human experience in a small physical space, the Whaley house checks multiple boxes. And then there is the fact that the original family believed it. Not the tourists, not the investigators. No one made this up. Thomas Whaley, who built the house, who chose the land, who was present for that hanging that preceded it, he believed it was haunted. Maybe it was just his mental state after watching a man get hanged where he now stood. Anna Whaley believed the house was responsible for the family's misfortunes. Their daughter Lillian acknowledged the ghosts to renters because she felt it was honest to do so. The haunting of the Whaley house was not invented by outsiders to attract visitors. It was acknowledged by the people who paid $10,000 to build it and move their family inside. That's the different kind of starting point than almost any other location in American paranormal history. Thomas Whaley knew what that land had witnessed before he built on it. He watched a man die there and came back anyway, with his wife and his plans and his brick-by-brick intention to build something lasting. And the house he built kept everything. The footsteps of a man who was hanged, the grief of a child who died too young, the despair of a daughter who could not find a way to stay, the weight of the parents who outlasted so much of the sorrow. The Whaley family is buried at Mount Hope Cemetery in San Diego. Thomas and Anna and most of their children. You can go stand at their headstones the same way you could stand at the Stillinger sisters' graves in Villisca. These are all real people. The same bricks, the same stairs, the same archway where Yankee Jim Robinson's boots scraped the dirt before the wagon pulled away are all still there. Whether the footsteps on the second floor are his, or whether they are something the building generates on its own from the accumulated weight of everything that happened inside it, that is a question that nobody has answered yet. The house receives the questions every night. It has been doing so since 1857, and by all accounts, it always has something to say back. We have one episode left this season. Everything we've covered has been heavy on its own. But the Hinsdale house hits different. Not because the evidence is more conclusive. It's not. But because of what the people who lived there say it did to them. The house in Cattaraugus County, New York has been investigated by some of the most experienced researchers in the field, and including, you guessed it, Ed and Lorraine Warren. What they found and what others found and what the family who lived there lived through is the kind of story that will just sit differently. I'm Johnny Clash and this is Paranormal Unsettled. In the quiet rural town of Hinsdale, New York, stands a weathered farmhouse that has become one of the most infamous haunted locations in America. Known as the Hinsdale House or the Dandy House. It gained notoriety through decades of terrifying stories tied to the property and the family who once lived there. In the 1970s, the Dandy family claimed they experienced violent paranormal activity inside the home that would make even the Conjuring house look tame. Objects reportedly moved on their own, dark figures appeared in the rooms, and strange voices echoed through the house at night. The activity became so disturbing that the family believed something inside the house was deliberately tormenting them. Their experiences would later inspire books, investigations, and countless paranormal documentaries. Over the years, the house became surrounded by stories of shadow figures, with unexplained scratches, disembodied voices, and sightings of entities lurking near the surrounding woods and pond, and even an exorcism that failed. But beyond the ghost stories and the internet legends, the Hinsdale house represents something far more unsettling. A place where fear, isolation, and human experience blurred together so completely that separating truth from terror became almost impossible. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Cattaraugus County sits in the southwest corner of New York State, a long way from the version of New York that most people picture. No skyline, no subway, just hills and dense forest, and the kind of deep rural quiet that has its own texture even when you're standing inside of it. The Enchanted Mountains, they call the region, a name that sounds charming until you're in those woods at night. On McMahon Road, outside the small town of Hinsdale, there is a farmhouse. It is a 2-story white wood frame structure sitting on 7.5 acres of land built in the mid-1800s. It's not a grand house. It's not a mansion. It is roughly 1,000 square feet of living space, with 4 modest bedrooms, a basement, an attic, and a crawl space. The kind of house that a working family would have been grateful to find in rural New York a century and a half ago. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but that feeling changes the second you step inside. Almost every single person who has ever walked through the front door of the Hinsdale house and have spent time there has noted the change. Some feel it immediately. Some feel it build over hours, but the consensus across decades of documented accounts, from accredited paranormal researchers to the families who have actually lived there, is that the house does something to the people inside of it that it cannot be attributed simply just to the building's age or the darkness of the surrounding woods. It gets personal. That's the word that's going to keep coming up. It gets personal in a way that most locations don't. This is the Hinsdale house. Before we talk about what happened inside the Hinsdale house, we need to talk about why the Dandy family went there in the first place. Because unlike so many haunted house stories, this one doesn't begin with ghosts. It begins with a family and trying to save a marriage. Clara and Phil Dandy had been together since 1955. By the late 1960s, they had built a life in Buffalo with their 4 children, Mike, Beth, Laura, and Mary. Years earlier, they had also lost a 5th child, Christina, who lived only a few days after birth. There were no dramatic arguments or defining moments that sealed this marriage's fate. They had simply just become 2 people caught up in raising a family and living separate lives but under the same roof. In 1968, they took a trip to Allegheny State Park in what Clara later described as one of the last attempts to reconnect. Something about being surrounded by the open countryside reminded them of the life they wanted together. They returned home, determined to find a place of their own away from the city. Their first step was buying a small cabin in nearby Cuba, New York, but Phil's work kept pulling him back into Buffalo before they could truly enjoy it. Eventually, they realized they didn't want a weekend escape. They wanted a completely different life. That's when they found the farmhouse on McMahon Road in Hinsdale. The property was everything they had hoped for. A white farmhouse built by the Everett brothers in 1853, and it sat on 7.5 acres, surrounded by towering oak trees, dense woods, and a quiet pond. Over the years, the house passed through several owners, some touched by tragedy, illness, and farming accidents. One former resident reportedly died by suicide in the home, but none of that concerned the Dandies. To them, it wasn't a haunted house, it was a fresh start. There was, however, one local legend they didn't know about. For generations, people in Hinsdale had claimed the property once served as a stagecoach inn, where travelers were robbed, murdered, and hidden beneath the building until the spring thawed them out, making burial possible. There's no historical evidence providing that story, and today it still remains exactly what it has always been, a local legend. But as you'll see later, discoveries made on the property decades after the Dandies left, some as recent as 2024, have caused some investigators to look at that legend a little differently. The family officially moved into the farmhouse in July of 1970, along with what Clara laughingly described as enough pets to fill a small zoo. Even the trip there felt unusual. Their station wagon, which had never given them trouble before, repeatedly overheated on moving day. They blamed it on the stress of moving and thought very little of it. But then they arrived. Every window of the farmhouse was covered with bees. Not just a few bees, thousands. The swarm covered the glass so completely that daylight barely reached the inside of the house. An exterminator eventually removed them, and the family dismissed it as one of those strange things that sometimes happens in the country. Looking back, Clara would wonder if this was the house's way of welcoming them or warning them. Their first winter brought exactly the kind of problems you would expect from an old farmhouse. Frozen pipes with unreliable hot water and constant repairs, which kept Clara busy while Phil struggled with an exhausting commute back and forth to Buffalo. But before long, things began happening that were much harder to explain. The family's dog repeatedly disappeared into the woods before returning with long bones in their mouth. Everyone assumed they had found animal remains somewhere on the property, so the bones were thrown away without much thought. It's a detail that we're going to have to remember because years later, investigators would begin to ask the same question that Clara eventually did. What exactly had the dogs been finding? Around the same time, a neighbor casually mentioned that a ghost was sometimes seen walking along McMahon Road. Clara smiled politely and dismissed it as another small-town ghost story. But that changed when Mike described seeing a tall, shadowy figure near the tree line, and another neighbor claimed someone often stood on the nearby hill watching the house. Clara looked several times herself, but never saw anything. At least not yet. Then during an ice storm that winter, Clara and the children witnessed something none of them could explain. A large, circular object hovered silently above them before suddenly just disappearing. Clara never called it a UFO because she didn't know what it was. She only knew what she had seen. Later, Mike woke up to an intense light shining through his bedroom window, and local newspapers reported sightings of unidentified objects over the area that same night. Coincidence? Looking back years later, Clara didn't describe those first months as terrifying. She described them as confusing. Each event could be explained away on its own. A swarm of bees, strange lights in the sky, stories from neighbors, dogs carrying bones. It wasn't any one incident that convinced her something was wrong. It was just a pattern. But the patterns didn't stop there. They started to ramp up. The family began to find themselves dealing with an unrelenting series of injuries and accidents. Broken bones, deep cuts, infections, burns, and even a car accident slowly took both a financial and emotional toll on the family. None of it seemed extraordinary by itself, but after a few months of living from one emergency to the next, Clara began wondering if bad luck had followed them to Hinsdale, or if it was Hinsdale making the bad luck. The family's pets proved harder to dismiss. Within a matter of weeks, 3 animals died unexpectedly, all of them somehow connected to Mary's bedroom. When they consulted their veterinarian, Clara was surprised by the advice she received. He suggested they keep the animals away from that room altogether. A weird response, Clara thought. Then the house itself began changing. One afternoon, Clara returned home to find the children convinced that someone had broken in. Clothes had been pulled from the dresser drawers, Mary's record player had been thrown across the room, and the family dog sat trembling in the corner facing the wall. Nothing had been stolen. There were no windows broken, no forced doors, and no sign that anyone had entered the house at all. Around the same time, another place on the property began standing out for all of the wrong reasons. During a winter storm of 1972, Clara drove to pick Mike and Beth up from a school dance. As lightning illuminated the road ahead, all 3 of them believed they saw the silhouette of someone hanging from a tree near the property. Clara slammed on the brakes, and when they looked again, there was no one there. But as they sat in silence, they all heard the same thing. The slow, creaking sound of something heavy swinging back and forth in the wind. From that night forward, the hanging tree was never just another tree. The family claimed to hear voices there, including the sound of a man quietly humming to himself at night. It became one of those places that they avoided whenever possible, and years later, one of the first places investigators wanted to examine. The children eventually asked if they could use a Ouija board. Clara thought little of it. To her, it was just a toy. After she left the house, the children gathered around the board in the living room and asked a simple question about what was happening in their home. According to them, the planchette suddenly shot across the board, and the candle burning beneath a nearby statue of the Virgin Mary lifted from its holder, traveled through the air, and landed at their feet before extinguishing itself. The children never touched the board again. Not long afterwards, Beth's favorite doll also became a source of fear. The children insisted it no longer felt like an ordinary toy. They described the unsettling feeling that it was somehow watching them. Eventually, Beth asked Clara to remove it from the house altogether, so she gave it to the neighbor. According to the neighbor, strange disturbances began in her home almost immediately, and the doll was quickly thrown away. But unfortunately, the garbage man plucked it out of the garbage and took it home himself. Who knows what happened to it? By 1973, Clara realized the biggest change wasn't happening inside the house. It was happening inside of her. She had always been someone who sang while cleaning, cooking, or simply just moving around the house. Somewhere along the way, she stopped. She never consciously made that decision. One day, she simply realized the music was gone, and her children had noticed it too. The house that was supposed to save their family no longer felt like a home. It felt like somewhere they were merely trying to survive.
Right back after commercial break.
By the summer of 1973, the Dandies no longer believed they were simply dealing with an unlucky streak. Whatever had been quietly building inside the house over the previous 3 years suddenly became impossible to ignore, and it started with the burn marks. Beth discovered a strange burn on her leg that she couldn't explain. When Clara mentioned it to the family, Mike admitted that he had developed an almost identical mark weeks earlier, but he never told anyone. Soon afterwards, similar burns began appearing on curtains and even houseplants inside the home. Clara later described it as though the house itself was leaving its signature on everything around them. For the first time, she stopped looking for ordinary explanations. Like most people, Clara reached out to someone she trusted, a cousin known as Father Bob, who came to the farmhouse, blessed the home, and prayed with the family. Clara appreciated his willingness to help, but she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing had changed. Before leaving, Father Bob encouraged her to find someone with experience investigating cases like theirs. That search led her to Father Alphonsus Trebold, better known as Father Al. Unlike many clergy at the time, Father Al didn't immediately dismiss reports of paranormal activity. He listened to the family's experiences. He spent time in the house and eventually told Clara he believed they were dealing with a poltergeist. He blessed the home and continued returning over the months that followed, becoming one of the few constants the family could rely on. Clara would later describe him as a light during one of the darkest periods of her life. Around the same time, a neighbor recommended a local psychic named Whaley. His conclusions affected Clara more deeply than anything that had happened inside the house. After his investigation of the property, Whaley told her he believed she was unknowingly fueling the activity herself. According to him, Clara possessed a sensitivity that acted as a source of energy, while Mary somehow channeled that energy into the violent disturbances taking place throughout the house. Clara believed his every word. Why wouldn't she at this point? The thought that she might somehow be responsible for what her children were experiencing consumed her. She lost a significant amount of weight, struggled to sleep, and later admitted she couldn't stop wondering if she had become part of whatever was haunting the house. As the family searched for answers, the activity continued escalating. One afternoon, Clara and several neighbors were gathered near the pond when Mary and her friend Susan came running back in tears. They insisted they had seen a woman standing across the water with bright red hair and prominent buck teeth. She appeared to be dancing before she suddenly just disappeared. Phil searched the area, but he found nothing. As everyone tried to make sense of what the children had seen, Mary quietly looked toward a nearby tree and said something Clara would never forget. "I'll bet she died on the hanging tree," which was an unusual thing for an 11-year-old to say. By the end of that summer, Mary's bedroom had become almost impossible to use. Family members and visitors alike described it as unusually cold and strangely oppressive. Clara once entered the room to light a candle when a stuffed animal suddenly flew towards her. Beth, whose bedroom was directly below, later heard furniture moving overhead and what sounded like someone climbing into bed. When she finally gathered the courage to go check, the room was empty. The only thing she found was the unmistakable impression of someone sitting on the edge of Mary's mattress. Not long afterward, Mary stopped sleeping there altogether. The room was closed, and looking back, Clara believed that marked the turning point. Until then, the family had been trying to understand what was happening in the farmhouse. Now, they were simply trying to live with it, and before long, whatever was inside the house would turn its attention towards the children in ways the family could never imagine. By the late summer of 1973, Clara and Phil had stopped asking whether the house was haunted. The question now was, who was it targeting? The first signs came from Laura. At just 12 years old, she began saying things that were deeply out of character. She accused several men in her life of assault, but when her parents tried to understand what she meant, Clara later said it felt as though she wasn't speaking to Laura anymore. The voice was familiar, but the personality behind it wasn't. Father Al and others involved with the case would later suggest that whatever was in the house needed someone through whom it could act. And for a long time, they believed that person was Laura. She also began telling people she was gonna die young. She spoke about it with an unsettling sense of certainty, insisting that she had already seen everything she was meant to see. Concerned for her safety, Clara and Phil eventually sent her to stay with her grandparents in Buffalo. According to those involved with the case and close to the family, the activity surrounding Laura quickly subsided. But it didn't disappear. It just shifted. On August 12th, Beth looked out her bedroom window and saw a woman standing outside in the darkness. She had long, wet hair, pale skin, and large, staring eyes fixed directly on Beth. The figure silently beckoned for her to come outside before disappearing into the night. It wouldn't be the last time Beth reported seeing her. Soon there were knocks on the window, voices calling Beth's name, and the unmistakable feeling that someone was waiting just outside the glass. As the activity intensified inside the house, word began spreading through Hinsdale. Rumors circulated through the community. Some people believed the dandies. Others accused them of making everything up. Rather than allowing the story to grow through gossip, Clara and Phil decided to speak publicly themselves. They agreed to do an interview with a local newspaper on the condition that names and the exact location of the property would be withheld. The paper didn't honor those wishes. Instead, it ran a front-page story complete with a photograph of the house. Almost overnight, the dandies found themselves living in a tourist attraction. Cars lined the road. People wandered onto the property. Some camped nearby, hoping to witness some activity for themselves. State troopers were eventually called to help control the crowds. One conversation during that time stayed with Clara for the rest of her life. A state trooper mentioned that his younger brother had died near the property a few years earlier. As he described him, Clara realized he matched the teenage boy that several witnesses had reported seeing walk along the pond just before vanishing before their eyes. For Clara, two seemingly unrelating mysteries suddenly became one. The house didn't only react to family members. Mike had a friend named Randy who frequently stopped by to visit. The family eventually noticed something unusual. When Randy was inside the farmhouse, the activity completely stopped. No strange noises, no moving objects, no disturbances. Randy desperately wanted to witness what everyone had been describing, but every visit ended the same way. The house simply went quiet. But Labor Day weekend changed that. Clara described the atmosphere inside the farmhouse as unusually heavy that day, almost as though the air itself had changed. Family members heard someone running around outside, but every time they looked, no one was there. Cold spots formed around Phil and Clara as they searched the property. Beth saw what appeared to be a young blonde girl sitting on her bed, while moments later, she watched a woman dressed in white run across the front porch. Then Clara witnessed something she couldn't explain. Standing in Beth's doorway, she watched the impression on the bed slowly rise as though someone invisible had just stood up. Father Al realized the family needed more help than he alone could provide. By coincidence, one of the country's best-known psychics happened to be speaking nearby. His name was Alex Tanous. Father Al intentionally told him almost nothing. He wanted Alex's impression to come without outside influence. But too bad for that newspaper article. But when Alex walked through the front door of the Hinsdale house, he had no idea what he was about to find.
Right back. Crucial break.
As soon as Alex stepped onto the property, he sensed something was wrong. According to Clara, he immediately began describing details he had no obvious way of knowing. He spoke of multiple spirits occupying the property and believed at least 7 distinct entities were present. Some he felt were simply lingering. Others were far more aware of the family sharing the house with them. Then he made a statement that stopped Clara in her tracks. Alex believed there had been numerous murders on the property and that human remains were buried underneath the old barn. For Clara, it was an unsettling connection to something she hadn't thought about in years. She remembered the family dogs repeatedly returning from the woods carrying those long bones. At the time, everyone assumed they belonged to deer or other wildlife. Listening to Alex describe bodies hidden beneath the property, she couldn't help but wonder if those dogs had been finding something else. This also goes back to the Stagecoach Inn. Alex also described an elderly woman whose presence he believed dominated the house. He claimed she resented the dandies for living there and viewed them as intruders. According to Clara, that explanation seemed to fit the growing feeling that whatever occupied the farmhouse wasn't simply haunting the family. It wanted them gone. But Alex's investigation didn't stop there. As he walked the property, he was repeatedly drawn to the hanging tree. He described it as one of the most emotionally charged locations on the land. He believed intense suffering had taken place there and suggested the tree had become a focal point for whatever remained on the property. Whether that impression reflected history or simply psychic interpretation remains impossible to verify, but it reinforced the fear that the dandies already felt whenever they went near it. Despite everything Alex described, life inside the farmhouse didn't improve. If anything, it became more dangerous. Not long afterward, Mike was involved in a serious car accident. During the investigation into the crash, one detail stood out to the family. The impression left in the windshield suggested that someone had been sitting in the passenger seat, even though Mike had been alone. Around the same time, Phil experienced something he rarely spoke about publicly. Mike spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Clara and Phil took turns staying with him and staying with the other kids. On one of the nights, Phil was home alone with the children. He was trying to sleep on the couch when movement in the room made him open his eyes. 5 small men came out of the closet. They were dressed in Puritan clothing, plain and old. They didn't look at Phil. They stood together, speaking quietly to each other, and what Phil heard them say was, "Do we wait, or do we take him now?" Then they turned around and left through the door. Phil believed they were talking about Mike and was sent into a panic. But fortunately, Mike came home on November 3rd. But the lasting effects of the crash would linger with him for the rest of his life. Then came Jeff. Jeff was dating Beth and had visited the house several times. Not long after they broke up, he was nearly killed in a violent car accident. Before anyone told him about the dandies experience, Jeff described seeing dozens of faces pressed against his windshield just moments before the crash. To the dandy family, it felt like whatever surrounded the house was no longer staying there. It was following people beyond the property, specifically at the end of the driveway. For Father Al, Alex, and the dandies, one conclusion was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. This was no longer simply a haunted house. Whatever was there appeared to be attaching itself to the people who lived inside of it. As 1974 approached, the focus of the haunting seemed to settle almost entirely on Beth. She complained of hearing voices outside her bedroom, calling her name late at night. Sometimes they sounded familiar, other times they didn't. She also began sleepwalking, often walking with no memory of leaving her bed or wandering through the house. Then came the moments that frightened the family the most. Without warning, Beth's blue eyes would suddenly appear almost black. During those episodes, Clara and Phil said her personality seemed to change completely. She began withdrawn, aggressive, and at times appeared not to recognize the people around her. Father Al believed whatever had been tormenting the family now attached itself to Beth. Even doctors noticed the shift in her personality and her eye color. In a desperate attempt to help the family from a distance, Alex sent a bracelet made from his own hair to Beth. He believed it might help shield her from whatever influence surrounded her. Whether it had any effect is impossible to know, but it will come up again later. In April of 1974, Alex returned with a team of investigators, a documentary crew, and recording equipment. Before they began, he instructed everyone to tape strands of his hair to each piece of equipment for protection. In Mary's room, Alex sensed the spirit of a young woman who had died in there after being locked inside. As he investigated, the same mysterious burn marks that had appeared on members of the Dandy family suddenly appeared on his back. Moments later, a camera light exploded. It was the only piece of equipment that hadn't been tagged with his hair. That evening, Alex drew the house's negative energy into himself while Father Al performed an exorcism. The Dandy family experienced vivid visions, and even the documentary crew reported hearing unexplained screams and growls coming from inside the walls. But that documentary, the footage, The crew packed up and left. Alex and Clara were told it would be processed, that they would receive a copy, and the story would be told. They never heard from them again. The footage has never surfaced. No one has ever explained what happened to it. It's simply gone. When it ended, Clara said the house finally felt peaceful for the first time. But that didn't last long. The exorcism failed. Other investigators visited the house during its final months, each offering different theories but few lasting solutions. Clara later wrote that every new visitor seemed able to identify the problem, but no one could make it stop. By then, the family had reached a difficult realization. They couldn't continue living there. Eventually, the Dandies packed up their belongings and left the farmhouse they once believed would save their family. Instead, it had become the place that nearly tore them apart. Leaving the house didn't instantly erase everything they had experienced, but it marked the end of a haunting that had dominated nearly 4 years of their life. Clara and Phil eventually divorced, and years later, Clara chose to document the family's experiences in Echoes of a Haunting, preserving the account that would introduce the Hinsdale house to a much wider audience. The story, however, didn't end when the Dandies drove away. In many ways, it was only the beginning. After the Dandies left, the Hinsdale house changed hands several times. Stories about the property continued to circulate throughout Western New York, but for years, the house remained little more than a local legend. Clara's book introduced the story to a much larger audience, and as interest in paranormal investigation grew, so did the house's reputation as one of America's most haunted locations. That reputation almost wasn't enough to save it. By the early 2000s, years of neglect had left the farmhouse in a really rough condition. Time, weather, and abandonment had taken their toll, and there were real concerns that the house might eventually be lost altogether. Then, in June of 2015, paranormal investigator Daniel Klass purchased the property. Rather than modernizing it or turning it into a tourist attraction, Klass focused on preserving the farmhouse while documenting its history. Over the years, investigators from all around the world had visited the property, not only to search for evidence of paranormal activity, but also to better understand the stories that have surrounded the land for generations. Then, investigators made an unexpected discovery. While examining an area near the property's pond, Daniel Klass and members of the Hinsdale House Restoration Project uncovered a pile of bones along with 4 shallow graves containing the boxed remains of 2 adults and 2 children. The identities of those individuals remains unknown, and no direct connection has ever been established between the graves and the old stagecoach legend. Even so, the discovery inevitably renewed interest in the property's earliest history and raised new questions about who these people were and how they came to be buried there. Now, following the discovery of those graves, in 2025, a memorial plaque was installed to honor those whose identities may never be known. Whatever their story was, they're now remembered as part of the history of Hinsdale. The Hinsdale house has also become known for another tradition. Deep in the woods stands what has become known as the Giving Tree. Unlike the Hanging Tree, the Giving Tree is a separate location on the property where visitors often leave offering before investigations. Some believe it's a way of showing respect to the land. Others see it as a symbolic act of leaving behind fear, grief, or personal burdens before entering the historic house. One of the people who helped preserve that sense of community was Ruth Overly Napierkowski. A dedicated member of the Hinsdale House Restoration Project, Ruth became a familiar face to countless investigators who visited the property over the years. She was remembered not only for her passion for the Hinsdale House, but for the kindness she showed to everyone who walked through its doors. Following her passing in 2025, many in the paranormal community reflected on the impact that she had made and quietly wondered whether someone who loved the house so deeply ever truly left it. Today, the Hinsdale house continues to welcome investigators from all around the world. Some leave convinced they've experienced something they can't explain. Others believe the legend has grown larger than the evidence. Clara and Phil moved to California in 1975. They divorced shortly after, and Clara changed her name back to Clara Miller. She is still searching for answers today and keeps in touch with Daniel Klass and other paranormal investigators. Mike unfortunately passed away in 2017 from complications from his accident on the property. Laura passed away in 1992, just a few days shy of her 30th birthday from an accidental prescription medication overdose. More than 50 years after the Dandy family packed up and left McMahon Road, people are still searching that old farmhouse for answers. And perhaps that's the real legacy that the Dandy family left behind.
Right back after this commercial break.
Daniel Klass's approach has been notably transparent compared to many other well-known paranormal locations. Rather than building mythology around the property, Klass has focused on documenting what investigators experience and preserving the house's history. Whether someone believed the activity is paranormal or not, that commitment to documentation has helped make Hinsdale one of the most consistently investigated haunted houses in America. Now, what the pop culture layer has added, as it always does, is volume and occasional overstatement. Episodes titled Demonic Oppression and A Night Turned Demonic that deliver genuine experiences but package them in language calibrated for maximum impact, but perhaps losing the true beauty of the home. The honest version of the Hinsdale house is still the one Clara Dandy documented in Echoes of a Haunting. It's a story that's unsettling not because it tries to shock you, but because it never feels like it's trying to. And while not a big theatrical release, Hinsdale House the movie released in 2019. It never found the same audience as films inspired by Amityville or the Parent family's experiences that became The Conjuring. Perhaps that's because one very notable pair of paranormal investigators never seemed to fully embrace Hinsdale the way they did other cases. I mentioned at the beginning that the Warrens investigated the property. I didn't find anything in great detail about their venture to Hinsdale, other than that they felt it the same way most other investigators do. I'm not sure if it was just an investigation they didn't fully claim as their own, or if it was overshadowed by Annabelle, Amityville, and the other popular cases they worked on during this period of time. Or perhaps the Dandy family didn't let them in, the way other families did. It seems Clara had a tight grasp on sorting the situation as best as possible. Maybe the Warrens didn't offer the house the best solution. Regardless, it garnered enough of their attention that they showed up. Tony Spira, who is Ed and Lorraine's son-in-law, joined Nick Groff on Paranormal Lockdown in the Hinsdale house. In the episode, he calls Lorraine Warren on the phone and asks if she remembered the visit to the house.
Do you remember going in that room at all, Mary's room?
Yes, it strangles me.
I was intrigued and I sat there with full attention because I hadn't found much on the Warrens' visit. But all she said was she remembered a strangling feeling in the same room that Nick Groff did. Her only solution to help Nick through his 72-hour lockdown was go to church. During that 72-hour lockdown in Season 1 from 2016, Nick Groff and Katrina Weidman produced intelligent EVP responses.
What? Do you hear that? Oh my God. It just goes, there's no heaven. This thing that is talking says there's no heaven.
Nick returns to the house in Season 4 of Deathwalker for a 2-part series alongside his wife Tessa in 2024, which is now available on Tubi. In this episode, Nick seeks some answers to questions that had been eating at him since his first visit. During this investigation, they meet with Daniel Klass and have someone come out to radar the land near the pond. This is where they potentially found those graves. At the end of the episode, they were able to reconnect with Clara Miller, and Tessa, a psychic medium, was even able to deliver a message from Mike. What's perhaps even more interesting is that despite coming from very different backgrounds and approaches, many investigators describe remarkably similar experiences. Sam and Colby, Shotzi Blackheart, Selena Spookyboo, and countless teams working alongside Daniel Klass have all reported discomfort around Mary's room. Whether that's expectation, coincidence, or something stranger is ultimately up to each investigator to decide. We started this season at the Sallie house and worked our way to Hinsdale. If I've learned anything from my research, the most unsettling thing about Hinsdale isn't Mary's room. It isn't the chanting, it isn't the doll or the apparitions or the bones found in the woods. It's the gap between how the house looks from the road and what so many people claim they've experienced inside. The unexplained in this series has never been primarily about the evidence. It's been about what the evidence points towards, about the lives that were lived inside these specific places, and about the question of what, if anything, those lives left behind. And the Dandy family certainly left something. This season on Paranormal Unsettled, we stepped inside the Sallie house, where stories of something unseen continue to raise questions. We stood in the rooms of the Villisca axe murder house, where a tragic night still echoes through history. We explored the Bellaire house, a place many believe holds more than just memories. We walked the halls of the Whaley house, where past and present seem to overlap, and entered the Hinsdale house, where experiences have left visitors with more questions than answers. Along the way, one thing became clear. These weren't just haunted houses. They're places shaped by history, perspective, and the stories we continue to tell. And with that, this season comes to a close. Thank you for being a part of it, for listening, for questioning, and keeping an open mind every step of the way. Paranormal Unsettled returns in October with Season 4, where we break down the most famous cases of Ed and Lorraine Warren, including the Perrin family haunting, the Enfield poltergeist, the Devil Made Me Do It, the Smurl haunting, and of course, one very close to home, the Amityville Horror. Until then, follow along, subscribe on YouTube for weekly case files and upcoming interviews, leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you choose to listen, and as always, listen with the lights on. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled.